My parents left a wrapped box on my doorstep with one warning: do not make a scene. Then they drove off. I opened it and nearly dropped to my knees. Trembling, I dialed 911. Minutes later, my husband stepped inside, saw two officers in our home, and turned pale. Please do not tell me they actually did it. My name is Evelyn, and I am 33 years old. I work as a forensic accountant, which means I spend my days tracking down missing money, uncovering corporate fraud, and exposing liars. I never thought my most devastating case would land right on my own front porch, delivered by the people who raised me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who tried to destroy your life. Growing up in an affluent suburb with my parents Richard and Patricia was a masterclass in maintaining appearances. To the outside world, they were the perfect, successful couple. My father was always boasting about his golf handicap, and my mother was perpetually coordinating charity luncheons. But behind the manicured lawns and the expensive cars, our family dynamic was deeply fractured. The undeniable center of their universe was my older brother Brandon. At 30 years old, Brandon was what you might call a perpetual entrepreneur. In reality, he was a master of jumping from one disastrous get-rich-quick scheme to another. He dabbled in cryptocurrency, launched failed lifestyle apps, and constantly pitched visionary ideas that required massive amounts of capital but yielded absolutely zero returns. While Brandon was handed luxury cars and seed money for his non-existent empires, I was expected to pave my own way. When I was applying to college, I discovered that my tuition fund had been quietly drained to cover the losses from Brandon's very first failed business venture. My parents told me that family requires sacrifice, and that I was smart enough to figure it out. So I did. I worked 3 exhausting jobs to pay my way through a rigorous accounting program. I graduated at the top of my class, earned my certifications, and built a highly successful career entirely on my own merit. I married David, a brilliant and supportive UX designer, and together we bought a beautiful home in a quiet, leafy neighborhood. We deliberately created a life defined by stability, honesty, and mutual respect. This was the exact opposite of the chaotic financial tightrope my parents walked to fund Brandon's delusions. It was a crisp Tuesday afternoon when the illusion of our polite family distance completely shattered. I had just returned home from a grueling 2-week audit of a major corporate client. I was exhausted, looking forward to nothing more than a quiet evening with David. As I walked up the driveway, I noticed a medium-sized box sitting directly in the center of our welcome mat. It was wrapped in heavy, expensive silver paper and tied with an immaculate navy blue silk ribbon. It was unmistakably my mother's handiwork. Patricia never did anything without ensuring it looked socially presentable. Tucked beneath the pristine ribbon was a pale yellow sticky note. The handwriting was my mother's elegant looping cursive. I pulled the note free and read the words that would ultimately destroy our family. Brandon needed a lifeline. We kept it in the family. Do not make a scene, just handle the paperwork. I stared at the yellow square of paper, a cold knot forming in the pit of my stomach. The phrase "handle the paperwork" triggered every alarm bell in my professional mind. My parents had never given me a gift that did not come with an agonizing string attached, but this felt entirely different. The sheer audacity of commanding me not to make a scene before I even knew what was inside told me this was not a simple request for a financial favor. I unlocked the front door, stepped into the quiet sanctuary of my foyer, and set the silver box on the entryway console table. I did not bother taking off my coat. With trembling fingers, I untied the silk ribbon and tore away the thick wrapping paper. Inside was a plain white cardboard filing box. I lifted the lid, and the breath was instantly knocked out of my lungs. Resting on top was a stack of heavy metallic credit cards bound together with a rubber band. I picked them up, fanning them out like a toxic deck of playing cards. Platinum rewards cards, elite travel cards, high-limit business accounts. Every single one of them bore my name, Evelyn Hayes. I flipped them over. The signature strips were blank, but the activation stickers had been peeled away. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I have maintained a flawless credit score my entire adult life. I guard my personal information with the extreme paranoia that comes from investigating identity theft for a living. Yet here were half a dozen premium credit lines opened in my name without my knowledge or consent. I could only imagine the staggering balances sitting on these accounts accumulating interest at 29% while Brandon lived his luxury lifestyle. But the credit cards were only the beginning. Beneath them lay a thick stack of legal documents clipped together. I pulled out the first packet. It was a comprehensive power of attorney document. I stared in absolute horror at the final page. There was my signature perfectly forged granting my mother Patricia full legal authority to execute financial agreements on my behalf. The document bore an official notary stamp. I recognized the name of the notary immediately. It was a woman who served on the same charity board as my mother. Patricia had leveraged her social connections to rubber stamp a fraudulent legal document. My mind raced calculating how this was even possible. I had placed security freezes on all my credit profiles years ago. Then the sickening realization hit me. Patricia knew every intimate detail of my life. She knew my social security number, my mother's maiden name, the street I grew up on, my childhood best friend, the name of my first pet. She had weaponized the basic facts of my existence to bypass the security questions and manually lift the credit freezes. She had used her knowledge as my mother to impersonate me perfectly. My hands were shaking violently now, but the forensic auditor inside me demanded I look at the final document in the box. It was printed on heavy watermarked legal paper from a major commercial bank. I unfolded it, and the bold red letters at the top of the page seemed to burn into my retinas. Notice of default and intent to foreclose. I scanned the dense legal text, my eyes jumping straight to the financial figures. The principal loan amount was $1.2 million. The loan had been secured against a piece of commercial real estate intended for Brandon's newest luxury office space. The borrower listed on the defaulted loan was me. They had used the forged power of attorney to leverage my flawless financial reputation to secure a massive commercial loan for Brandon, a loan he had completely defaulted on. The bank was now coming after the guarantor. Me. My parents had wrapped up a $1.2 million financial bomb, placed a neat little bow on it, and dropped it on my porch, expecting me to simply absorb the devastation to protect their golden child. They actually believed that my conditioning as the responsible, quiet daughter would force me to silently pay the price for Brandon's failures. They expected me to handle the paperwork to save them from public embarrassment. For a fraction of a second, the terrified, unloved child inside me wanted to collapse onto the hardwood floor and weep. I wanted to call my mother and scream, asking how she could possibly do this to her own flesh and blood. I wanted to ask why Brandon's luxury lifestyle was worth destroying my entire future. But that child was silenced instantly by the cold, calculating professional I had become. The tears never fell. Instead, an icy, laser-focused clarity settled over my mind. I was not a helpless daughter seeking their conditional love anymore. I was a federal financial investigator, and I was looking at a box full of felony wire fraud, grand larceny, and aggravated identity theft. They had severely miscalculated. They thought they were dealing with family, but they had just handed a confession to an auditor. I did not call my mother. I did not text my brother. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed 911. The emergency dispatcher answered on the second ring, her voice calm and practiced. 911, what is your emergency? I did not hesitate. I did not let the lifetime of conditioning about protecting my family's pristine country club image stop the words from leaving my mouth. I would like to report a felony identity theft and major wire fraud. I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. The perpetrators have forged legal documents to secure a commercial real estate loan exceeding $1 million using my stolen credentials. They have also opened multiple fraudulent lines of credit. The dispatcher paused, likely accustomed to frantic calls rather than the clinical assessment I was providing. Are you in immediate physical danger, ma'am? No, I replied. My eyes locked on the defaulted loan notice sitting on my entryway console table. I am safe. But the financial crime is extensive, and I have the physical evidence right here in front of me. The suspects are known to me. I gave her my address and answered her standard questions with rapid-fire precision. When she asked for the names of the suspects, I did not flinch. I gave them Richard and Patricia Hayes and Brandon Hayes. I spelled out my own mother's name for a police dispatcher without my voice shaking even once. I hung up the phone and stood perfectly still in my quiet house. The silence felt heavy pressing against my skin. I did not sit down. I did not want to sink into the couch and risk letting the shock catch up with me. Instead, I began organizing the contents of the silver box into a neat row on my dining room table. I grouped the credit cards by issuer. I placed the forged power of attorney next to the commercial default notice. I was building a case file. 10 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled into my driveway. I watched through the front window as two uniformed officers stepped out. One was a veteran with silver hair at his temples, and the other looked relatively new to the force. I opened the door before they could even knock. "Good afternoon," I said, stepping aside to let them in. "I am Evelyn Hayes." I made the call. The older officer introduced himself as Officer Miller and his partner as Officer Davis. They stepped into my foyer, their eyes immediately landing on the meticulously arranged documents on my dining table. "Ma'am, you mentioned on the phone that your identity was stolen by family members," Officer Miller said, pulling out a notepad. "This is usually a civil matter when it involves relatives. We always suggest families try to work these things out internally before filing official reports." I looked Officer Miller dead in the eye. "With all due respect, officer, this is not a civil dispute over a borrowed car or a missing television. This is grand larceny. I am a licensed forensic accountant and federal auditor. What you are looking at on that table is a carefully orchestrated, premeditated financial crime. They forged a notary stamp on a power of attorney document to bypass bank security. They secured a $1.2 million commercial loan and defaulted on it. They opened 6 premium credit cards and maxed them out. They committed federal wire fraud. I am not working this out internally. I want to press full criminal charges." The sheer volume of the numbers and my absolute refusal to back down shifted the atmosphere in the room instantly. Officer Miller closed his mouth, nodded respectfully, and clicked his pen. "Understood, Ms. Hayes. Let us get everything documented." For the next 20 minutes, I walked them through the paperwork. I explained the mechanics of the forgery. I pointed out the discrepancies in the signature. I showed them the dates on the credit card statements, highlighting how the spending correlated with my brother Brandon's recent social media posts about his luxury lifestyle. The officers took detailed notes, their initial skepticism completely replaced by grim professionalism. They were treating my living room like a crime scene, which was exactly what it was. We were right in the middle of logging the credit card numbers when I heard the familiar hum of my husband's car pulling into the driveway. Through the window, I saw David park his sedan. He stepped out, his tall frame moving with his usual relaxed confidence until he spotted the police cruiser parked directly behind my car. He stopped dead in his tracks. I watched him hurry up the walkway, his brow furrowed in deep concern. The front door swung open and David rushed inside. He was wearing his usual work attire, a dark button-down shirt and slacks, looking every bit the successful UX designer he was. But the moment he crossed the threshold and saw the 2 armed police officers standing in our dining room, his relaxed demeanor vanished. He dropped his heavy leather laptop bag onto the floor. It hit the hardwood with a loud, heavy thud that echoed through the quiet house. His eyes darted from the officers to me, then down to the silver wrapping paper discarded on the floor, and finally to the neat rows of maxed-out credit cards and legal documents spread across our table. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him ashen. "Please do not tell me they actually did it," David said. His voice was barely a whisper, thick with a mixture of dread and absolute fury. The officers turned to look at him. Officer Davis placed a hand on his utility belt instinctively. "Sir, who are you? This is my husband, David." I intervened quickly, moving to his side. "David, my parents left a box on the porch today. They took out a commercial loan in my name for Brandon. It is in default for over $1 million. David closed his eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. He ran a hand through his dark hair, gripping the strands tightly at the roots. I knew it, he muttered bitterly. I knew that is what they were doing. Officer Miller stepped forward, his pen poised over his notepad. Excuse me, sir. You are saying you had prior knowledge of this crime. David opened his eyes and looked at the officer, his jaw set in a hard, angry line. Not the crime itself, he clarified. But I caught them laying the groundwork. Evelyn, I need to tell you what happened 6 months ago. I did not want to believe it was true, and I did not want to cause a massive fight with your parents without proof, but this explains everything. I stared at my husband, my heart pounding against my ribs. What happened 6 months ago, David? He turned to face the officers, ensuring they were documenting his every word. It was the weekend of your mother's charity gala. David explained, his voice steady, but laced with barely suppressed anger. You were out running errands for the event. Your mother Patricia and your brother Brandon came over early to drop off some centerpieces. I was in the kitchen fixing a broken cabinet hinge. I heard a floorboard creak upstairs right above me. In your home office, I felt a cold chill wash over my skin. My home office was strictly off limits. I kept highly sensitive client data in there, along with my own personal financial records. My family knew this rule perfectly well. I walked upstairs quietly. David continued. The door to your office was wide open. I caught Patricia and Brandon standing behind your desk. Your mother had your personal filing cabinet pulled open. She had a stack of your tax returns and banking documents in her hands. Brandon was taking photos of the documents with his smartphone. Officer Miller stopped writing and looked up, his expression hardening. You witnessed them photographing her sensitive financial documents. Yes, David said firmly. I walked in and demanded to know what the hell they were doing. Patricia did not even flinch. She gave me this condescending smile and completely gaslit me. She claimed she was just looking for a pen to write down a recipe for you, and that Brandon was taking a picture of a nice lamp you had on your desk. It was the most absurd, insulting lie I had ever heard. I told them to get out of the office immediately. I stared at David, trying to process this revelation. Why did you not tell me they were in my files? I did tell you they were snooping, David said softly, his eyes filled with regret. Remember, I told you that night that your mother was pushing boundaries and that I caught her going through your desk. I told you to freeze your credit immediately because I did not trust them. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. He had told me. We had a long conversation about my mother's complete lack of boundaries. David had been adamant that I lock down my financial profiles. I did freeze my credit, I said, my voice rising in panic as I looked at the officers. I put hard security freezes on every single credit bureau that very same night. It is impossible to open a line of credit, let alone a commercial real estate loan, with those freezes in place. The bank would have rejected the applications automatically. Officer Davis frowned, gesturing to the table. But they obviously managed to do it, ma'am. How? I stared at the paperwork, the gears in my analytical mind turning rapidly. To lift a credit freeze manually, you need to call the bureau or log into the portal. You have to answer a series of highly specific security questions to prove your identity. Questions that go way beyond a social security number. The realization hit me so hard my knees went weak. I reached out and gripped the edge of the dining table to steady myself. David stepped closer, placing a supportive hand on the small of my back. They bypassed the security questions, I whispered, the sheer magnitude of the betrayal wrapping around my throat like a vice. When you set up those security profiles, the banks ask you intimate questions. What was the name of your first pet? What street did you grow up on? What was the make and model of your first car? What is your mother's maiden name? I looked up at Officer Miller, my vision blurring with angry, unshed tears. My mother did not just steal my social security number. She used the intimate knowledge of raising me to impersonate me. She used the name of the golden retriever we had when I was 6. She used the street address of the house she still lives in. She weaponized my own childhood against me to bypass federal banking security protocols. David pulled me into a tight embrace and I buried my face in his shoulder. He held me fiercely, acting as the physical anchor I desperately needed in that moment. "They are going to pay for this, Evelyn," he murmured against my hair, his voice vibrating with absolute conviction. "We are going to bury them." Officer Miller cleared his throat respectfully. "Ma'am, we have enough here to file the preliminary report for aggravated identity theft and wire fraud. Given the dollar amount, this exceeds local jurisdiction. This is a federal crime. I am going to have to escalate this to the Financial Crimes Division. Once this report is filed, there is no turning back. Your parents and your brother will be facing serious criminal charges. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed?" I pulled back from David's embrace. I stood up perfectly straight, smoothing down the front of my blouse. The brief moment of vulnerability had passed, replaced entirely by cold, calculated resolve. My parents had treated me like a disposable asset my entire life. They had used my hard work to fund my brother's arrogance, and they had done it while hiding behind the sacred shield of family loyalty. They thought I would quietly clean up their mess because I was the good daughter. I looked at the silver wrapping paper lying discarded on the floor, then back to the officer. "I am absolutely certain," I said. "File the report." Officer Miller nodded, once his expression resolute. He handed me a business card with a case number hastily scribbled on the back. They packed up their notes, secured the copies of the evidence I had provided, and walked out the front door. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving David and me standing in the center of our dining room. The silence that followed was suffocating. We both knew that a ticking time bomb had just been activated, and it was only a matter of time before the shockwave hit the suburbs. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of cold water. My hands had finally stopped shaking. The forensic auditor in me had fully taken over, compartmentalizing the emotional betrayal into a locked mental filing cabinet. David followed me, leaning against the marble counter. He watched me with a mixture of awe and deep concern. I took a slow sip of water, staring out the window at the fading afternoon light. We did not speak a single word to each other. There was absolutely nothing left to say until my arrogant parents realized what was coming for them. The wait was agonizing but brief. Federal investigations take time to build, but local police responding to a high-dollar fraud complaint tend to make preliminary contact quickly. They needed to secure statements. They needed to establish a timeline. And most importantly, they needed to let the suspects know they were under official scrutiny. Exactly 42 minutes after the white police cruiser backed out of my driveway, my cell phone vibrated against the granite countertop. The sharp buzz made both David and me flinch. I did not reach for it immediately. It vibrated again, then a third time in rapid succession. A relentless, angry rhythm. I walked over and looked down at the illuminated screen. The notifications were pouring in from our family group chat. The chat was named The Hayes Family, complete with a little heart emoji my mother had added years ago to maintain the illusion of our perfect domestic bliss. Right now, that chat was exploding. I picked up the phone and unlocked the screen. David stepped up behind me, reading over my shoulder as the text messages materialized one after another in rapid-fire bursts. Patricia was typing furiously, completely abandoning her usual, carefully curated, polite persona. The mask had slipped, revealing the terrified, vicious manipulator underneath. Evelyn Marie Hayes. The first message read, "I just received the most humiliating, absurd phone call of my entire life from a local police detective. Did you actually call the cops on your own family?" Before I could even process the words, another block of text appeared. "Answer me right now. The detective said you filed a felony report. What is wrong with you? You are acting like an absolute psychopath. Over a simple family loan? We are Family Evelyn. We handle things internally. We do not drag the authorities into our private business." David scoffed, reading the screen. A simple family loan. They really believe they can just rebrand massive financial fraud. The messages kept coming. Now my father, Richard, was typing. "Evelyn, your mother is in tears. You are causing an unnecessary scene. Brandon just needed a little capital to get his new venture off the ground. You have plenty of money. You are being entirely selfish and overreacting. Call the precinct back and tell them it was a misunderstanding. Fix this immediately." Then came Brandon. "Wow. Trying to send your own brother to jail because you are jealous of my ambition. You always were a bitter, miserable person. Mom and Dad are right. You are genuinely unhinged. Just sign the consent forms and stop being a dramatic loser." I read the words over and over again. The sheer delusion was breathtaking. They had stolen my identity, leveraged my pristine financial history, and saddled me with a debt that would take lifetimes to repay. Yet in their minds, I was the villain. I was the unhinged psychopath for refusing to be their sacrificial lamb. They were so deeply entrenched in their own toxic echo chamber that they actually believed they were the victims of my unfair boundaries. They expected me to cave. They expected the weight of their collective disappointment to crush my resolve. For 33 years, that tactic had worked. I had always backed down to keep the peace. I had always swallowed my anger to avoid ruining a holiday or a family dinner. Not today. I tapped the text entry box. The cursor blinked, waiting for my response. I did not type out an emotional paragraph. I did not demand apologies or ask how they could betray me. I engaged the exact same tone I used when delivering audit findings to hostile corporate boards. Cold, factual, and completely devoid of sentiment. I typed my response with deliberate, steady strikes. "I will not be calling the precinct back. I will not be dropping the charges. What you did was not a simple family loan. A loan requires consent. You forged my signature, bypassed federal security measures, and stole my identity. $1.2 million is not a family favor. It is grand larceny. It is felony wire fraud. You crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Do not contact me again unless it is through your defense attorneys." I stared at the block of text for a fraction of a second, feeling the immense gravity of the moment. Then I hit send. The message delivered instantly. The three little typing bubbles that had been dancing at the bottom of the screen suddenly vanished. The group chat went completely terrifyingly silent. The harsh reality of my written words had finally penetrated their thick layer of shared delusions. They realized they could not simply bully their way out of this catastrophic situation by screaming at me. I set the phone face down on the smooth granite counter and released a long, slow breath. The silence lasted for exactly 2 minutes. I watched the second hand on the kitchen clock sweep past the 12 twice before the screen of my phone lit up again. The brief pause had not been a moment of reflection or a sudden dawn of remorse. They had simply been regrouping, shifting their tactics from outright intimidation to deep psychological warfare. The phone vibrated continuously, inching across the granite countertop like a trapped insect. David reached out and placed his hand over mine. "You do not have to read them," he said gently. "You can block their numbers right now. The police have everything they need." I shook my head and slid the phone toward me. "I need to see exactly what they are willing to say. I need to know how far they will go to justify this." I unlocked the screen. The group chat was active again, but the tone had shifted. My father had taken the lead, stepping in to play the role of the disappointed patriarch. "Evelyn, you are tearing this family apart over money," Richard wrote. "You have always been so materialistic. Your brother made a minor miscalculation with his business, and instead of helping him fix it, you are trying to destroy his life. You are acting entirely selfish right now. Family requires sacrifice. We all make sacrifices for the people we love." I stared at the word sacrifice. It burned on the screen. A hot, suffocating wave of anger rose in my chest, completely obliterating the cold, detached professionalism I had tried to maintain. They dared to speak to me about sacrifice. They dared to call me selfish. My fingers hit the keyboard with furious energy. I did not hold back. The years of biting my tongue and keeping the peace evaporated completely. "Do not lecture me about sacrifice," I typed back. "You drained my entire college tuition fund when I was 18 years old. You took $60,000 that was meant for my education and handed it directly to Brandon so he could develop a social networking app that never even launched. You left me with absolutely nothing 2 months before my freshman year began." David read the message over my shoulder and let out a harsh breath. He knew the story well, but seeing it weaponized in writing made the reality of their abuse glaringly obvious. The response from my mother came almost instantly. Patricia was quick to defend her choices completely, rewriting history to suit her narrative. "We did what we had to do," Patricia texted. "Brandon had a unique opportunity and timing was critical. We knew you were smart enough to figure it out. You got scholarships. You were fine. Do not use ancient history to justify your cruel behavior today." I typed my response before her message even finished processing in my brain. I was not fine. I worked 3 jobs to pay for that degree. I woke up at 4 in the morning to open a coffee shop, went to classes all day, worked at the campus library in the evening, and did overnight data entry on the weekends just to afford my textbooks and rent. I exhausted myself to the point of physical collapse while Brandon sat in his luxury apartment playing entrepreneur with my money. "I sacrificed my youth to pay for your golden child." The chat showed Brandon typing. He could not resist defending his bruised ego. He never could handle being reminded of his failures. "Are you seriously still crying about something that happened 15 years ago?" Brandon wrote. "You need to move on, Evelyn. You are obsessed with holding grudges. I paid you back for that anyway." I felt a humorless laugh escape my throat. "You bought me a $200 gift card to a steakhouse for my college graduation," I replied. "That was your repayment for stealing my tuition. And now you have stolen $1.2 million. This is not ancient history, Brandon. This is a clear documented pattern of financial abuse. You take what is mine and Mom and Dad enable you. But it ends today." My father jumped back into the fray, his texts arriving in rapid succession. His attempt to play the rational peacemaker quickly dissolved into outright gaslighting. "You are being hysterical," Richard wrote. "Nobody stole anything. We simply leveraged family assets to secure a temporary line of credit. If you had just answered your phone and listened to us instead of calling the police like a lunatic, we could have explained the repayment structure. But you always assume the worst about us. You have this victim mentality that is frankly exhausting to deal with." I read his words and felt a profound sense of disgust. They were actually trying to convince me that I was the problem. They had forged a legal document, used my social security number, and defaulted on a massive commercial loan, but in their minds, my reaction was the true crime. They wanted me to believe that my reality was distorted. I looked up at David. His jaw was clenched tight. "They are unbelievable," he said quietly. "They will never admit what they did. They will spin this until they believe you are the villain." He was right. They lived in a completely different reality. They operated under a set of rules where Brandon was infallible. Their actions were always justified, and my sole purpose was to absorb the damage. I looked down at the phone one last time. My father sent another message. "We raised you better than this, Evelyn. Cancel the police report. We will come over tomorrow to discuss how we are going to fix this credit issue. Do not do anything else to embarrass this family." I did not type a response. I did not explain the law again. There was no point arguing anymore. I tapped the screen a few more times to disconnect from the group chat permanently. I was absolutely done. The silence in the kitchen lasted barely a minute before my phone screen illuminated again. I had muted the family group chat, but I had not turned off my cell phone completely. A new name flashed across the display. It was Aunt Susan, the younger sister of my mother. She was a woman who practically worshipped the ground my parents walked on, always eager to secure an invitation to their country club dinners and holiday galas. I stared at her name, feeling a dull ache behind my eyes. I knew exactly why she was calling, but a small, naive part of me hoped that maybe my mother had told her the truth, and she was calling to offer support. I swiped the green button and lifted the phone to my ear. Before I could even say hello, her sharp, accusatory voice pierced through the speaker. "Evelyn, what on earth is wrong with you? Your mother just called me in absolute hysterics. She can barely breathe because of what you have done." I closed my eyes and let out a heavy breath. "Aunt Susan, do you even know what they did to me? Do you know why I called the police?" "I know that you are acting like a spoiled, vindictive child," she snapped. "Your mother told me everything." Brandon had a minor cash flow issue with his business, and they used a family asset to float him a temporary loan. And instead of acting like a supportive sister, you sicked the federal authorities on them. You are trying to destroy your own family over a piece of paper. A piece of paper, I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Susan? They forged my signature. They stole my identity to take out a commercial loan for over $1 million and then defaulted on it. They ruined my financial standing. She scoffed loudly, the sound vibrating with pure disdain. Oh, please. It is just money, Evelyn. You make plenty of it at that fancy accounting firm of yours. You have a huge house and a husband with a great job. Brandon is struggling. He just needed a little help getting his feet off the ground. You have always been so jealous of the attention he gets. And now what? You are going to send your own brother to jail because you are feeling petty. You are going to let your parents be dragged away in handcuffs. I looked at David, who was listening to the one-sided shouting match with wide, disbelieving eyes. The sheer audacity of her logic was staggering. She was completely minimizing a $1 million felony to protect the family hierarchy. They committed a federal crime. Susan Rafferty stated firmly, refusing to let her emotional manipulation steer the conversation. I did not force them to break the law. I'm simply reporting it. You are destroying your mother, Susan shrieked. She gave you life. She raised you. You owe her everything, and this is how you repay her. I will not stand by and let you do this. The entire family knows what you are doing, Evelyn. Tyler and Melissa are disgusted with you. We are all disgusted. If you do not call the police right now and drop these charges, you are going to be completely cut off from this family. We will never speak to you again. The threat hung in the air, heavy and venomous. For a woman who thrived on social inclusion and family gossip, being cut off was the ultimate punishment. But she fundamentally misunderstood what I valued. You cannot cut me off, Susan, I replied, my voice steady and cold. Because I am walking away. Do not ever call this number again. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red end call button, cutting off her frantic sputtering. Immediately, a text message popped up from my cousin Tyler, the son of Susan. It was a long paragraph filled with profanity, calling me a traitor and telling me I was dead to him. The flying monkeys had been officially deployed. My parents had weaponized the extended family, sending them to harass me into submission. It was a classic abuse tactic, designed to make me feel so isolated and hated that I would cave just to stop the onslaught. I did not read the rest of the message from Tyler. I went into my phone settings and blocked his number. Then I blocked Aunt Susan. I systematically blocked every aunt, uncle, and cousin who had enabled the toxic behavior of my parents. I blocked them all, severing ties with dozens of people in minutes. David watched me, his expression softening with profound empathy. He walked over and wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. You did the right thing, he murmured quietly. You are protecting us. I leaned back into his solid warmth, feeling the last remnants of doubt wash away. I pulled away gently and walked over to my laptop sitting on the kitchen island. Officer Miller had emailed me the digital copy of the official police report for my final review and electronic signature. It was the last step required to cement the charges and initiate the formal investigation. I opened the document and read through the clinical, devastating facts of the crimes my parents committed. The official police report held no emotion, only dates, amounts, and penal codes. It was exactly what they deserved. I typed my full legal name into the signature box, applied my digital certification, and clicked Submit. A green confirmation banner appeared on the screen, verifying that the report had been successfully filed with the authorities. The conflict was permanently cemented. There was no going back, no sweeping it under the rug, and no dropping the charges. The war for my future had officially begun today. The next morning arrived with a cold, biting wind that rattled the windows of our bedroom, but I had already been awake for hours. I moved through my morning routine with a mechanical precision, showering, dressing in my sharpest charcoal blazer and tailored trousers, and drinking a single cup of black coffee. David kissed my forehead before I walked out the door, his silent support fortifying the armor I was strapping on for the day. I drove to my office building in the heart of the downtown financial district, finding a strange comfort in the familiar towering glass and steel architecture. My firm occupied the top 3 floors of the high-rise, a prestigious accounting group that catered to high-net-worth individuals and massive corporate entities. It was a fortress of logic, mathematics, and irrefutable facts. It was exactly where I needed to be, to block out the emotional chaos my parents had unleashed. I parked in my reserved spot in the underground garage, grabbed my leather briefcase, and took the private elevator up to the main reception floor. The polished marble floors clicked under my heels as I stepped out of the elevator bay. The lobby of my firm was designed to intimidate and impress, featuring massive modern art installations, minimalist leather seating areas, and a massive mahogany reception desk flanked by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. I took a deep breath, inhaling the faint scent of expensive coffee and citrus room spray, feeling my professional persona lock firmly into place. I was Evelyn Hayes, senior forensic auditor. No one could touch me here. I gave a polite nod to our lead receptionist, a sharp young woman named Chloe, and turned toward the secure double doors that led back to the executive suites. Before I could even swipe my keycard against the electronic reader, a sharp voice cut through the quiet, refined hum of the lobby. "Evelyn, stop right there." The voice was shrill and commanding, carrying an undeniable note of wealthy suburban entitlement that I recognized instantly. Every muscle in my body seized. I froze, my hand hovering just inches from the security scanner. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, praying that my ears were deceiving me. But when I turned around, the nightmare of yesterday materialized right in front of me. Standing near the visitor seating area were Richard and Patricia. My father wore a tailored navy suit, trying to project his usual country club authority, though his posture was unusually rigid. My mother was dressed in a pristine beige trench coat and designer pearls, clutching a thick manila folder against her chest like a shield. They looked entirely out of place in my professional sanctuary, like 2 toxic elements invading a sterile laboratory. My heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs, but I forced my facial expression to remain completely blank. I let my hand drop from the security scanner and turned to face them fully. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice low and dangerously even. "I told you yesterday not to contact me again unless it was through a defense attorney." My mother marched across the marble floor, her heels echoing sharply in the cavernous space. She closed the distance between us with aggressive speed, stopping just a foot away to invade my personal space. "We do not need attorneys, Evelyn," Patricia hissed, her eyes darting nervously toward the reception desk, where Chloe was pretending to type while very clearly listening. "We are your parents. We are family. You are not going to ruin our lives over a simple misunderstanding." My father stepped up right behind her, using his height to try and physically intimidate me. He cast a quick, calculating glance around the luxurious lobby, clearly noting the wealth and prestige of my workplace. "This is exactly why we came here," Richard said, his voice dropping into the harsh, demanding register he used when he expected immediate obedience. "You have a reputation to maintain in this building. Do you really want your colleagues to know that you are the kind of unstable, vindictive daughter who calls federal authorities on her own flesh and blood? You are going to fix this mess right now before it spirals completely out of control." Patricia shoved the manila folder toward me. I did not raise my hands to take it. She practically shoved the thick paper against my chest, forcing me to step back to avoid the physical contact. "Open it," she commanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and desperation. "Look at what I brought you." I looked down at the folder, refusing to touch it. It fell from her grasp and landed on the marble floor between us. The top document spilled out, displaying a header filled with dense legal jargon. I did not need to pick it up to know what it was. My forensic training allowed me to read the bold print upside down. It was a retroactive consent form, a legally binding document that, if signed, would state that I had full prior knowledge of the $1.2 million commercial loan and had authorized Richard and Patricia to execute the agreement on my behalf. It was a get-out-of-jail-free card. If I signed that piece of paper, the forgery became authorized delegation. The identity theft became a mutual business arrangement. The grand larceny became a legally sanctioned loan. It would instantly invalidate my police report and shield them from the devastating federal consequences they had rightfully earned. "You are going to sign that consent form today," Richard stated, pointing a thick finger at the document resting on the marble floor. "You will date it for 6 months ago prior to the loan origination. Then you will call the detective assigned to your ridiculous complaint and tell him you made a terrible mistake. You will say you forgot that you gave us permission to secure the funding for your brother, and if I refuse, I asked, keeping my voice deadpan." Patricia stepped closer, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "If you refuse, we will tell everyone how cruel you are. We will contact every single aunt, uncle, and cousin. We will call David and his family. We will destroy your reputation until you have absolutely no one left. We will make sure everyone knows that you are a bitter, jealous sister who tried to lock up her own parents just to watch her brother fail. You will be a complete pariah, Evelyn." I stared at them, absorbing the absolute venom in her threat. They truly believed social isolation would break me. They thought losing their approval and the respect of our extended relatives would force me into a panicked compliance. It was the same tired tactic they had employed my entire life. I let the silence hang between us for a long moment, allowing the absolute absurdity of her threat to settle into the cold morning air. Then I looked down at the folder on the marble floor and let out a short, humorless laugh. "I am not signing that piece of paper," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the vast lobby. "You can call every single person in our extended family. You can call David's parents. You can take out a billboard on the interstate for all I care. The police already have the forged documents and the original fraud report. I am not committing perjury to cover up your federal crimes." The color drained completely from my mother's face. The realization that her ultimate weapon of social destruction held absolutely no power over me seemed to break her brain for a fraction of a second. She stared at me, her mouth slightly open. But Patricia was nothing if not adaptable. When intimidation failed, she instantly pivoted to her secondary tactic, the theatrical martyrdom. Right there in the middle of my corporate lobby, my mother let out a loud, shuddering sob. She crumpled perfectly, dropping to her knees on the polished marble, as if her legs could no longer support the weight of her maternal grief. She reached out with trembling hands to gather the scattered documents, weeping with loud, heaving gasps that were designed to carry across the entire floor. "How could you do this to us?" Patricia wailed, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "We gave you everything. We sacrificed our entire lives to give you a good home, and you treat us like criminals. You are trying to destroy your own father and me over a simple mistake. What kind of daughter does this?" I stood frozen, mortified, despite my best efforts to remain detached. The elevator bay chimed, and a group of senior partners stepped out, freezing in their tracks as they took in the spectacle. Chloe, the receptionist, had stood up behind her massive mahogany desk, her eyes wide with alarm. Several junior associates walking past paused, whispering to each other as my mother continued to cry loudly on the floor, clutching the folder to her chest like a wounded animal. She was playing the victim flawlessly. To anyone watching, I looked like a cruel, heartless corporate monster, towering over a devastated, fragile, older woman. It was a brilliant, manipulative performance, designed to leverage public shame against me, in the very place where I needed to maintain absolute professional authority. Richard knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder, while glaring up at me with manufactured disgust. "Look at what you are doing to your mother," he reprimanded loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the gathering crowd of my colleagues. "Have you no shame, Evelyn? Have you no decency?" My heart hammered, a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to remain slow and steady. I could not let them win this public battle of optics. I could not let them turn my workplace into a stage for their toxic family drama. I looked over at Chloe and gave her a subtle, reassuring nod to silently communicate that I had the situation under control even though my stomach was churning. "Get up, Mom," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level, devoid of the anger she was trying to provoke. "You are making a scene, and I will not discuss this in the middle of the lobby." I turned on my heel and walked toward the heavy glass doors of the nearest executive conference room. It was a transparent, soundproof cube designed for high-level client negotiations. I swiped my security badge, opened the door, and stood aside. If you want to talk to me, you will do it in here. Otherwise, I am calling security to have you both removed for trespassing. The threat of being forcibly escorted out by uniformed guards was enough to snap my mother out of her theatrical weeping. The loud sobs stopped almost instantly. She allowed my father to help her up from the marble floor, smoothing down her pristine trench coat with shaking hands. She sniffled softly for the benefit of the watching partners, wiping away a single non-existent tear before following me into the conference room. Richard stepped in right behind her, his jaw locked in fury. I let the heavy glass door swing shut. The magnetic lock engaged with a solid click, completely sealing us off from the lobby. The soundproofing was absolute. Through the thick glass walls, I could see my colleagues slowly dispersing, returning to their desks, but their curious glances lingered. In this transparent box, we were fully visible, but entirely unheard. The instant the door sealed, the fragile, weeping mother routine vanished completely. Patricia straightened her posture, her face hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated spite. She threw the manila folder onto the polished oak conference table with a violent smack. "You are going to regret this," she hissed, her voice dropping the tearful tremor entirely. "You are going to sign that paper, Evelyn." Richard stepped around the large table, deliberately invading my personal space. He cornered me against the glass wall, his face red with a volatile, explosive anger. He pointed a finger directly at my face. "You owe us for raising you," Richard demanded, his voice low and vibrating with menace. "We put a roof over your head. We fed you. We gave you a life. You owe us everything you have, and you are going to pay us back by signing that damn consent form right now." Brandon is a visionary. He just needed capital to get his ideas off the ground. He is doing things you could never even comprehend with your boring little spreadsheets. You are just jealous of his ambition. You have always been jealous of him because he dreams bigger than you ever could. I stared at my father, absorbing the absolute venom in his words. He was cornering me, using his physical size to try and force me into submission, defending a 30-year-old man who had literally stolen over $1 million. He genuinely believed that providing basic food and shelter during my childhood entitled him to destroy my entire financial future and frame me for federal wire fraud. The sheer delusion was staggering. I did not shrink back against the glass. I stood my ground, looking directly into his angry, desperate eyes. The cold, analytical part of my brain isolated his words, dissecting them with surgical precision. They were absolutely terrified of the impending federal consequences. The lingering illusion that they possessed any genuine parental love for me evaporated completely within that sterile, transparent conference room today. I did not flinch. I did not step back or lower my gaze. Instead, I let a profound, icy calm wash over me. The screaming, the intimidation, the desperate attempts to make me feel small, none of it worked anymore. I looked at the man who had spent my entire childhood demanding perfection while simultaneously treating me like an afterthought. I looked at the woman who had just faked a hysterical breakdown in my lobby to try and shame me into submission. They were no longer my parents. They were simply two panicked suspects trying to intimidate a witness. I stepped to the side, smoothly bypassing my father and his aggressive posture. I walked to the center of the long oak table where the polished multi-line conference phone sat. I pressed the silver button for the front desk. Chloe answered on the first ring, her voice tight with professional concern. "Chloe," I said, keeping my tone conversational and completely steady. "Please contact building security. I need 2 guards sent to conference room B immediately to escort 2 trespassers off the premises." "Yes, that is correct. They are becoming hostile and refuse to leave." "Thank you." I disconnected the line. Patricia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in genuine horror. Richard stared at me, the redness in his face deepening into a mottled purple. For a moment he looked as though he might actually lunge across the table. "You are calling security on your own parents?" Patricia asked, her voice cracking as the reality of the situation finally pierced her delusion. "Evelyn, you cannot do this. We are your family. You are humiliating us in front of your entire firm." "You humiliated yourselves," I replied coldly. "I asked you not to contact me." You chose to ambush me at my place of work, stage a theatrical crying fit on the floor of my lobby, and then corner me in a glass room to demand I aid and abet a federal crime. I am simply enforcing the boundary you refuse to respect. You ungrateful wretch! Richard spat, slamming his fist down on the solid oak table. The loud crack reverberated through the soundproof room. We came here to give you a chance to make things right. We came here to save you from making the biggest mistake of your life. Brandon is going to be a massive success, and when he is, you will get nothing. You will be cut out of this family forever. I am already out, Richard, I said, dropping the title of dad completely. And as for Brandon, he is not going to be a massive success. He is going to be a convicted felon. And unless you leave this building right now, you are going to join him. Through the glass walls, I saw the elevator doors slide open. Two large, uniformed security guards stepped out, their expressions serious and focused. Chloe pointed them directly toward our transparent conference room. My colleagues, who had been pretending to work, visibly paused to watch the drama unfold. The sheer public embarrassment of the moment was beginning to register on my mother's face. She grabbed the manila folder from the table, clutching it to her chest, her eyes darting around like a trapped bird. Richard, she whispered, tugging at his sleeve. We need to go. They are actually coming. My father straightened his suit jacket, trying desperately to salvage some shred of his country club dignity. He shot me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. This is not over, Evelyn. You are going to regret treating us like this. You will be begging us for forgiveness when you realize what you have thrown away. The magnetic lock on the conference room door clicked and one of the security guards pulled it open. Ms. Hayes, the guard, said, his voice deep and authoritative. Is there a problem here? These two individuals were just leaving, I said, gesturing toward the door. They are not to be permitted past the lobby ever again. If they return, please bypass the desk and call the police directly for trespassing. The guard nodded and stepped aside, gesturing for my parents to exit the room. Ma'am, sir, it is time to leave the premises. Patricia kept her head bowed, hiding her face behind the collar of her expensive trench coat as she hurried out of the room. She was terrified of making eye contact with any of the partners or associates who were watching the scene. Richard walked out with stiff, angry strides, refusing to look at the guards. I followed closely behind them, ensuring they were actually escorted all the way to the elevator bay. The walk across the marble lobby felt like it took an eternity. The silence in the office was deafening. No phones were ringing, no keyboards were clicking. The entire floor was captivated by the sight of our firm's senior forensic auditor having two well-dressed older people physically removed from the building. I kept my posture rigid and my chin high. I would not let them see me sweat. I would not let them think they had compromised my professional environment. When we reached the elevator bank, one of the guards pressed the call button. The polished steel doors slid open immediately. Richard grabbed Patricia's arm and pulled her into the empty car. He turned around to face me as the guards stepped back to allow the doors to close. His face was a mask of furious desperation, still believing he could somehow intimidate me into submission with one last glare. I stepped forward, stopping just inches from the threshold of the elevator. I looked directly into his eyes, bypassing the anger and speaking straight to the fear hiding underneath. I kept my voice incredibly low, ensuring that only he and my mother could hear my final words. You did not just steal from your daughter, I said, enunciating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. You stole from a federal auditor. You have no idea what you have just triggered. The color drained completely from Richard's face. The sheer gravity of my statement finally crashed through his wall of entitlement. For the very first time, he looked at me, not as his disobedient child, but as the dangerous financial investigator I truly was. Patricia let out a soft, terrified gasp, her hands gripping the manila folder so tightly her knuckles turned white. I stepped back. The steel doors glided shut, sealing them inside and severing our physical connection. The glowing numbers above the elevator descended, taking them down to the parking garage and out of my life. I stood in the quiet elevator bay for a long moment, allowing the adrenaline to slowly filter out of my bloodstream. The confrontation was over. The physical threat had been removed. I turned around and walked back toward the reception desk. Chloe was looking at me with a mixture of shock and profound respect. I am so sorry about the disruption, Chloe, I said smoothly, offering her a polite, reassuring smile. They will not be a problem anymore. Please ensure building security has their photographs on file. Of course, she replied. I gave her a final appreciative nod and turned down the quiet hallway toward my corner office. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the confrontation was beginning to recede, leaving behind a sharp buzzing exhaustion. I walked into my office, closed the heavy mahogany door, and sat down at my desk. My dual monitors glowed with spreadsheets for a corporate merger I was auditing, but the numbers swam meaningless before my eyes. I could not focus on a client's financial discrepancies when a massive unexploded financial bomb was sitting on my own dining room table at home. I opened my email client and drafted a direct message to my managing partner. I requested 2 weeks of immediate paid time off, citing an urgent family legal crisis. Given the highly public spectacle that had just occurred in our lobby, the approval email arrived in my inbox less than 3 minutes later. No questions asked. I locked my workstation, packed my briefcase, and left the building. The drive home was a blur of gray skies and brake lights. When I unlocked my front door, the house was perfectly still. David was at his design studio, leaving me completely alone with the silence. I walked straight into the dining room. The documents from the silver box were still exactly where the police officers had left them, arranged in neat, damning rows. I did not bother changing out of my tailored work clothes. I simply took off my blazer, rolled up my sleeves, and went to my home office to retrieve my supplies. I brought back a stack of legal pads, an array of colored highlighters, my encrypted personal laptop, and a large whiteboard. The dining room was no longer a place for family meals. It was a forensic war room. I sat down at the head of the table and pulled the commercial loan default notice toward me. $1.2 million. The sheer size of the principal meant the disbursement would leave a massive, unmistakable footprint. Criminals always think they can hide money, but money is incredibly loud. It leaves a paper trail, digital footprints, and routing signatures. You just have to know how to listen to it. I opened my laptop and booted up a secure public records database I used for skip tracing and asset verification. I typed in the loan origination number and the securing bank's routing sequence found at the bottom of the default notice. My initial assumption, based on my mother's pathetic sticky note, was that the bank had wired the funds directly into Brandon's personal checking account, or his primary business account. Brandon was notorious for his lack of subtlety. He posted his entire life on social media, bragging about bottle service at clubs and leasing exotic cars. If he had received a lump sum of over $1 million, I expected to see a direct, sloppy transfer, followed by massive, immediate withdrawals for luxury goods. But as I traced the disbursement wire from the commercial lender, the forensic trail did not lead to Brandon at all. I highlighted the receiving account number in bright yellow and ran it through a corporate registry database. The funds had been wired to a holding account belonging to a limited liability company registered in Delaware. I frowned, tapping my pen against the legal pad. Delaware is a notoriously opaque state for corporate filings, offering high levels of anonymity for business owners. Brandon did not know the first thing about corporate structuring or registered agents. He barely knew how to file his own standard tax returns. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes scanning the transaction history of the holding account. The $1.2 million had not sat in the Delaware account for more than 48 hours. Instead, it had been fractured. The money was systematically broken down into smaller randomized increments. $50,000 transferred here, $82,000 wired there, $115,000 moved to a completely different routing number. I grabbed a red pen and began drawing a flowchart on my whiteboard, mapping out the movement of the funds. This was not a simple family loan. This was a classic money laundering technique known as layering. The perpetrators were deliberately moving the funds through a complex web of transactions to obscure the original source and separate the money from the forged loan documents. I tracked the first fractured wire transfer. It bounced from the Delaware holding company to a regional bank in the Midwest, then was immediately wired to a business account registered in Wyoming. another state famous for corporate secrecy. I tracked the second wire. It followed a similar dizzying path, moving through two different credit unions before landing in a corporate trust account. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the house pressing against my ears. A cold sense of dread settled heavy in my stomach. This level of financial obfuscation required sophisticated knowledge of banking regulations, wire protocols, and corporate law. This required someone who understood how to set up shell companies, obscure beneficiary ownership, and evade basic financial tracking. Brandon was an arrogant, failing entrepreneur who thought cryptocurrency buzzwords made him a financial genius. He was absolutely incapable of orchestrating a multi-layered, multi-state financial structuring scheme. He simply did not possess the intellectual capacity or the patience to execute this. My eyes drifted over to the stack of premium credit cards. I picked up the top statement and cross-referenced the transaction dates. The cards had not just been swiped at high-end retail stores or luxury car dealerships. They had been subjected to maximum cash advances. Thousands of dollars pulled in pure cash, then deposited into obscure regional banking accounts that mirrored the exact same layering pattern as the commercial loan disbursement. They were bleeding my credit profiles dry and funneling the stolen cash right into the same complex web of transactions. I stared at the paperwork coldly. If Brandon lacked the intellectual capacity to engineer a multi-state money laundering operation, there was only one logical conclusion left. The architects of this fraud were the very people who had dropped the box on my porch. My father had spent 30 years working in commercial real estate and wealth management before retiring to play golf and host dinner parties. He possessed the exact specialized knowledge required to structure corporate entities and layer massive financial transactions. My mother possessed the ruthless social cunning to execute it without breaking a sweat. I pushed the credit card statements aside and pulled my laptop closer. I needed to pivot my investigation away from my brother and focus entirely on Richard and Patricia Hayes. If they had orchestrated this level of felony fraud, they were not just trying to bail out their golden child. People with their level of country club pride did not risk federal prison just to fund a failing smartphone app. They were hiding something much larger. They were desperate. I logged into a specialized legal database used to track civil litigation, property liens, and corporate bankruptcies. I typed in my father's legal name and the address of their sprawling suburban mansion. The search query took a few seconds to process, a small blue circle spinning on the screen. When the results populated, I physically recoiled from the desk. The screen was painted in red warning flags. The pristine, wealthy facade my parents had maintained my entire life was an absolute fabrication. According to the county clerk records, my parents had 3 separate secondary mortgages on their primary residence. They had leveraged their home to the absolute maximum limit. But it did not stop there. I scrolled down the page, my eyes widening with every line. There were 2 active tax liens filed by the Internal Revenue Service against my father for unpaid capital gains taxes. There was a civil judgment against my mother for defaulting on a massive personal loan she had secured from a private wealth group 3 years ago. My parents were not just struggling, they were completely insolvent. They were actively drowning in millions of dollars of debt, teetering on the very edge of total financial ruin. I grabbed a blue marker and began writing the figures on my whiteboard. The math was staggering. They had kept up their country club memberships, their luxury car leases, and their lavish holiday parties, while secretly defaulting on every major financial obligation they possessed. The crushing weight of their pristine social image had finally bankrupted them. But personal bankruptcy would mean public humiliation. It would mean losing the mansion, surrendering the cars, and facing the judgment of their wealthy friends. Patricia would rather die than be poor in front of her social circle. They needed an influx of untraceable cash to pay off their aggressive private creditors and keep the IRS at bay. They needed a sacrificial lamb. I turned my attention back to the Delaware Limited Liability Company that had received the initial $1.2 million commercial loan disbursement. I paid the premium access fee to pull the expedited incorporation documents from the state registry. The PDF downloaded to my desktop. I opened it and zoomed in on the registered agent and the executive officer listings. The breath hitched in my throat. I felt a sudden sharp pain behind my eyes. The managing director of the Delaware Shell Company was listed as Evelyn Hayes. They had not just forged a power of attorney to secure a commercial loan. They had stolen my identity to construct an elaborate corporate shield. Because their own credit was entirely destroyed by liens and defaults, they could not secure funding under their own names. They had used my flawless, hard-earned financial reputation to incorporate a ghost company. Then they funneled the stolen $1 million through that entity, creating a tangled web of transactions to hide the money from their own creditors. The sticky note my mother had left on the box suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. Brandon needed a lifeline. We kept it in the family. It was a carefully constructed lie designed to manipulate my emotions. They wanted me to believe I was saving my foolish brother. They knew I resented Brandon, but they also knew I had a strong moral compass. They banked on the hope that I would quietly pay off the debt or absorb the credit hit to avoid sending my brother to prison. But Brandon was just a decoy, a convenient, believable excuse for the missing money. The $1.2 million was not going to fund a cryptocurrency venture or a luxury office space. It was going to pay off Richard and Patricia's secret debts. They were using my stolen identity to launder money, paying their own creditors through the shell company they had pinned entirely on me. If I had signed that retroactive consent form in my office lobby today, I would not have just been authorizing a loan for my brother. I would have been legally claiming ownership of a fraudulent shell company. I would have become the sole mastermind of a multi-state money laundering operation. When the federal authorities inevitably caught up with the transaction anomalies, Richard and Patricia would have been completely insulated. I would have been the one facing decades in a federal penitentiary while they continued attending their charity galas. I sat perfectly still in the quiet dining room. The afternoon light filtering through the windows cast long, cold shadows across the scattered documents. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal was almost too massive to process. They did not just steal my money. They had systematically, deliberately planned to serve me up to the federal government on a silver platter to save their own skin. I picked up my phone to call the federal agent working my case. I unlocked the screen, fully prepared to hand over everything. Then my eyes landed on the top file. The file sitting on the very top of the stack was a consolidated ledger from the Delaware Holding Company. I had initially pushed it aside to focus on the commercial loan disbursement, but a specific string of incoming wire transfers caught my attention. The numbers did not align with the narrative of a simple real estate loan default. In forensic accounting, you do not just look at where the money goes. You have to look at where every single penny originates. I sat my phone down on the desk, the federal agent's number forgotten for the moment. I pulled the ledger closer, grabbing my yellow highlighter. There were 6 incoming wire transfers deposited into the shell company over the past 8 months. They were substantial amounts. $50,000, $75,000, $100,000. They predated the commercial loan by almost half a year. I typed the originating routing numbers into my secure tracking software, watching the screen as the database processed the request. When the originating institution populated on my monitor, my blood ran completely cold. The account did not belong to a bank or a private equity firm. The registered owner of the originating account was the Oakfield Children's Benevolent Fund. I felt the air leave my lungs. My mother, Patricia, had served as the chairperson of the Oakfield Children's Benevolent Fund for the past decade. It was her crowning social achievement. She hosted lavish galas, gave tearful speeches about helping underprivileged youth, and constantly used the charity to elevate her status among the local country club elite. I had attended those galas as a teenager wearing uncomfortable dresses, while my mother paraded me around to show off her philanthropic dedication. My hands actually trembled as I began cross-referencing the dates of the charity transfers with Brandon's social media timeline. The correlation was undeniable and absolutely sickening. 7 months ago, Brandon had posted frantically about a massive margin call in his cryptocurrency portfolio. He had leveraged assets he did not possess, betting heavily on a digital token that subsequently crashed. 2 days after his panicked posts, the Oakfield Children's Benevolent Fund wired $75,000 to the Delaware Shell Company, registered in my name. The Shell Company then immediately transferred those exact funds to a major offshore cryptocurrency exchange. This was not just about my parents hiding their personal bankruptcy. This was an active, ongoing embezzlement scheme. My mother was systematically draining the charity accounts she controlled to cover Brandon's catastrophic gambling losses. When Brandon lost money, Patricia simply wrote a check from the charity, disguised it as a vendor payment or consulting fee to the fake Delaware corporation, and funneled the cash directly to her son. The sheer depravity of the crime was almost too much to process. Patricia was stealing from sick and disadvantaged children to ensure her 30-year-old son could cover his crypto margins and continue driving leased sports cars. She smiled at wealthy donors, collected their checks, and then routed those donations straight into the black hole of Brandon's financial incompetence. But the embezzlement created a massive problem for my parents. Charities require annual audits. The Oakfield Children's Benevolent Fund was due for its mandatory independent financial review at the end of the fiscal year, which was rapidly approaching. The auditors would immediately flag the missing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Patricia and Richard needed to replace the stolen charity funds before the accountants arrived, or my mother would be exposed and arrested. That was the true purpose of the $1.2 million commercial loan. They had not taken out that massive loan to fund Brandon's fake real estate venture. They had stolen my identity and leveraged my pristine credit to secure a massive influx of cash. I traced the most recent transactions on the whiteboard, with my red pen, the horrifying picture coming into perfect focus. They had planned to use the commercial loan to quietly refund the charity accounts, effectively covering their tracks before the annual audit. The remaining balance would pay off their most aggressive personal creditors, and they had anchored the entire criminal enterprise to me. The Delaware Shell Company was registered in my name. The commercial loan was guaranteed by my forged signature. If the bank initiated an investigation into the loan default, or if the charity auditors noticed the suspicious circular flow of funds, the federal authorities would follow the paper trail directly to my doorstep. Patricia and Richard had meticulously designed the perfect scapegoat. They were willing to sacrifice my freedom, my career, and my entire future to protect their social standing and keep their precious son out of a federal penitentiary. I stood up from the dining room table, my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. A profound, suffocating wave of disgust washed over me. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their approval. I had worked 3 jobs in college when they stole my tuition money. I had built a successful career while they mocked my independence. I had always believed their cruelty was rooted in simple favoritism and narcissism. I never imagined it extended to this level of calculated sociopathic malice. They were monsters. There was no other word for it. They wore tailored suits and designer pearls. They drank expensive wine and played golf with local politicians. But underneath the wealthy suburban veneer, they were absolute monsters. They stole from children. They framed their own daughter. I walked into the kitchen and poured my cold coffee down the sink. I washed my hands under the running faucet, scrubbing the soap into my skin, as if trying to wash away the feeling of being biologically related to them. The last lingering shred of guilt over calling the police completely evaporated. Any hesitation I felt about destroying their lives was gone. They had already declared war on me, and I was going to finish it. I walked back to the dining room, picking up my phone. I tapped the screen of my phone, but I did not immediately dial the local police precinct. My thumb hovered over the keypad as a new terrifying layer of clarity settled over my mind. The retroactive consent form that my parents had tried to force me to sign in the lobby of my firm was not just a shield against identity theft charges. It was a perfectly designed confession to a federal crime. If I had caved to their theatrical pressure and signed that document, I would have legally admitted to incorporating the Delaware Shell Company. I would have taken ownership of the bank accounts used to receive the stolen money from the Oakfield Children's Benevolent Fund. I would have become the sole mastermind of a multi-million-dollar charity embezzlement scheme, while my mother, the actual chairperson of the charity, walked away completely clean. She would have played the devastated mother of a white-collar criminal, probably using my arrest to garner even more sympathy and donations from her wealthy friends. The realization was physically nauseating. I had spent 33 years trying to earn the love of two people who had meticulously plotted to destroy my entire life to cover their own tracks. They did not see a daughter when they looked at me. They saw a scapegoat, a convenient, highly credentialed fall guy. I took a deep breath, pushing the nausea down into the dark, locked compartment of my mind where the rest of my grief resided. The local police were no longer equipped to handle the sheer magnitude of this crime. Officer Miller had mentioned escalating my initial report to the Financial Crimes Division, but local detectives would take weeks to unravel a multi-state money laundering operation involving offshore cryptocurrency exchanges and nonprofit embezzlement. I needed a federal hammer, and I needed it right now. I navigated to the contacts list in my phone and found a number I had saved from a joint task force audit I conducted 2 years ago. The number belonged to Special Agent Thomas Carter, a senior investigator with the Federal Bureau of Investigation who specialized in corporate fraud and white-collar crime. Agent Carter was sharp, unrelenting, and notoriously efficient. I pressed the call button and raised the phone to my ear, listening to it ring. The connection clicked open on the third ring. Carter, a deep, gravelly voice, answered. "Agent Carter, this is Evelyn Hayes," I said, keeping my voice incredibly steady. "We worked together on the offshore logistics audit back in 2024. There was a brief pause on the line as he placed the name. "Evelyn, yes, I remember you. You found the hidden accounts in the Cayman Islands that cracked the whole case wide open. What can I do for you?" "I am calling to report an active multi-state wire fraud and charity embezzlement scheme," I stated, pacing slowly around the perimeter of my dining room table. "The perpetrators have stolen over $1 million from a commercial lender and embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from a registered nonprofit organization. They are actively using a Delaware shell company to launder the funds into offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. The amounts are escalating, and the perpetrators are attempting to coerce a false confession from a witness to frame them for the operation. I have the entire paper trail mapped out, including the originating routing numbers and the ledger disbursements." Agent Carter let out a low whistle. "That is a substantial claim, Evelyn. Do you have the physical evidence to support this level of financial structuring?" "I have the commercial loan default notice, the shell company incorporation documents, the fraudulent credit card statements, and the internal ledgers showing direct wire transfers from the Oakfield Children's Benevolent Fund," I replied without hesitation. "The chairperson of the charity is the primary architect of the embezzlement. She is funneling the stolen donor money through the shell company to cover her son's catastrophic crypto margin calls. I have cross-referenced the transaction dates with digital footprints. The forensic audit is virtually complete, and the evidence is entirely airtight. I can have a digitized, encrypted dossier sent to your secure portal within the next 30 minutes. I could hear the sound of a keyboard clacking rapidly in the background. Agent Carter was already taking notes. "You said they are attempting to frame a witness?" He prompted, his tone shifting into absolute federal authority. "Who is the fall guy they are trying to set up?" I stopped pacing and looked down at the forged power of attorney document resting on my table. "Me," I said softly, allowing just a fraction of the raw reality to bleed into my professional demeanor. "They stole my identity to incorporate the shell company. They forged my signature to secure the commercial loan. The perpetrators are my mother and my father." The line went completely silent. Even a seasoned federal investigator needed a second to process parents orchestrating a federal trap for their own daughter. "I am sending you a secure link now," Carter said, his voice stripped of casual familiarity. "Package everything you have. Do not confront them again. Do not answer their calls. If they show up at your home, call local dispatch immediately and inform them that this is an active federal investigation." I will get a warrant authorized tonight to freeze every single asset connected to that shell company and the charity. I thanked him and ended the call. I stood in my dining room, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. There was no turning back now. The local police complaint had been a warning shot, but this federal escalation was a nuclear strike. I had just handed the FBI everything they needed to dismantle my parents' entire lives. I walked back to my laptop and began compiling the encrypted dossier. I was no longer just a victim of identity theft. I was a federal whistleblower, and I was going to watch my parents' pristine country club facade shatter into a million pieces. The silence from my family over the next 4 days was absolute. I expected angry messages or another ambush at my office. There was nothing. It was a calculated, deliberate quiet. They were waiting to see what the local police would do. True to form for complex financial crimes at a local precinct, the initial investigation appeared to stall. Officer Miller had forwarded the report, but without immediate federal intervention visible to them, my parents assumed the authorities had tossed my complaint into a pile of civil disputes. They thought they had won the standoff by simply ignoring it. During those 4 days, I went to work and audited corporate ledgers as if my personal life was not hanging in the balance. Behind the scenes, Agent Carter was moving with terrifying efficiency. He confirmed receipt of my encrypted dossier and informed me that a federal grand jury subpoena was being drafted for the bank records and charity accounts. The FBI was building an ironclad cage, and my parents were wandering around inside it, completely oblivious to the locks clicking shut. On the 5th day, the silence broke. I was sitting at my kitchen island on a Saturday afternoon when my phone screen illuminated. It was a single, highly polished text message from Patricia. Evelyn. The message began devoid of her usual dramatic punctuation. Your father and I have done a lot of soul-searching. We recognize that tensions ran too high at your office, and we deeply regret how things escalated. We want to apologize. We want to make this right. Please let us take you and David out for a reconciliation dinner this Tuesday at Le Petit Chateau. No lawyers, no shouting, just family trying to heal. We miss you. I stared at the screen, my facial expression totally flat. Le Petit Chateau was the most exclusive, expensive French restaurant in the city. My mother was deploying her favorite tactic. She was using money and public prestige to buy compliance. She genuinely believed that offering me an overpriced plate of duck confit would magically erase felony wire fraud. David walked into the kitchen carrying a basket of clean laundry. He leaned over to read the message on my screen and let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. A reconciliation dinner. Are they completely out of their entire minds? They are not out of their minds, I replied, turning the screen off. They are terrified, but they think they have the upper hand again. They think the police dropped the investigation because no one has shown up to arrest them yet. They are shifting from intimidation to manipulation. David frowned, crossing his arms. So what is the play here? They want to get you into a highly public, fancy environment where you are conditioned to be polite and quiet. They are going to ambush you with that retroactive consent form again. Exactly, I agreed. They want to trap me in a social setting where I cannot make a scene. My mother knows I hate public confrontations. She is banking on my professional decorum to keep me in my seat while they strong-arm me into signing away my identity. They want to play the benevolent parents in front of the waitstaff while sliding a pen across a white linen tablecloth. You are not going to reply. Are you? David asked, concern creeping into his voice. I looked at the dark screen. The wheels in my head were turning, aligning the facts of my federal case with the psychological profiles of my parents. Agent Carter needed them fully relaxed. He needed them feeling victorious while the FBI finalized the asset freezes. If I ignored them, they might panic and start moving the money offshore faster than federal warrants could intercept it. If I agreed to go, they would focus all their energy on manipulating me at that dinner, buying the federal task force crucial time. I am going to reply, I said softly. I am going to accept the invitation. David stared at me as if I had just suggested we burn our house down. Evelyn, no. You cannot sit across a table from them. They will use your presence there to claim that everything is fine and that you agreed to a civil settlement. It is a massive trap. I know it is a trap. I stood up and walked around the kitchen island. But it is a trap designed by amateurs. They think they are luring a scared, obedient daughter into a corner. They have no idea they are inviting a federal informant to dinner. David watched my face, seeing the unyielding resolve locking my features into place. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. If you are going, I am going. I am not letting you sit in that restaurant alone. Desperate people are unpredictable. I would not want to do this without you, I told him honestly. But we have to play our parts perfectly. We are going to walk into that restaurant acting hesitant but hopeful. We are going to let them think their charm offensive is working. We are going to let them talk. I unlocked my phone, opened the message thread with Patricia, and typed a brief neutral response. David and I will be there on Tuesday. I sent the text message. Patricia replied less than a minute later with a single heart emoji. The sheer sociopathic disconnect of sending a digital heart after stealing $1 million and embezzling charity funds was staggering, but it confirmed my hypothesis. She thought she had won. She thought the storm had passed, and the loyal daughter was coming back to clean up her mess. I spent the rest of the weekend mentally preparing for the performance of a lifetime. I knew exactly which emotional buttons they would try to press. I armored myself against every single one of them. I was stepping willingly into the lion den, but I was the one holding the leash. Early Monday morning, I drove to a nondescript federal building located just outside the city limits. Agent Carter had arranged the meeting far from my usual financial district haunts to ensure complete operational security. I sat across from him in a sterile, windowless conference room that smelled faintly of industrial floor cleaner. I slid a heavy encrypted flash drive across the metal table. It contained the complete finalized forensic dossier. Every wire transfer, every shell company incorporation document, every fraudulent credit card statement, and the devastating proof of the charity embezzlement were neatly categorized and cross-referenced. Agent Carter plugged the drive into his secured terminal and reviewed the files in total silence for nearly 20 minutes. When he finally looked up, his expression was a mix of professional approval and grim realization. He confirmed that the evidence was absolutely ironclad. The federal prosecutor was already drafting the grand jury subpoenas, but Carter needed one final piece to lock the cage tight. He needed them to explicitly confess to their intent. Agent Carter leaned forward, resting his forearms on the metal table. He explained that because we lived in a state that permitted one-party consent for audio recordings, I had the legal right to record my own conversations without informing the other participants. If I could get Richard and Patricia to openly admit to forging my signature and funneling the charity money into Brandon's accounts, the defense attorneys would have absolutely no room to maneuver in a federal courtroom. It would elevate the case from a complex paper trail to a slam-dunk criminal conviction. I did not hesitate for a single second. I told him I had a dinner scheduled with them the following night at Le Petit Chateau, and I was perfectly willing to wear whatever recording equipment the Bureau required. Carter nodded clearly, respecting my cold efficiency, and brought in a technical specialist to go over the operational parameters. The specialist did not hand me a bulky wire taped to my chest like you see in old crime movies. Modern federal surveillance equipment is remarkably elegant and terrifyingly discreet. He presented me with a tiny specialized recording module disguised as a high-end designer brooch. It looked exactly like the kind of understated expensive jewelry my mother would expect me to wear to a place like Le Petit Chateau. The microphone was omnidirectional and designed to filter out ambient restaurant noise while capturing nearby voices with crystal-clear precision. The specialist walked me through the activation sequence, showing me how to turn it on with a simple, natural brush of my fingers against the clasp. Agent Carter gave me strict parameters for the dinner. I was not to interrogate them or act like a prosecutor. I just needed to play the role of a hesitant, stressed daughter looking for a way out of the mess. I needed to let them do the talking. By Tuesday evening, the tension in my house was thick enough to cut with a knife. David paced our bedroom while I stood in front of the full-length mirror, securing the recording brooch to the lapel of my tailored navy suit. My reflection showed a woman who looked composed and professional, but underneath the silk and wool, my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. David walked up behind me and placed his hands on my shoulders, meeting my eyes in the mirror. He looked incredibly handsome in his dark gray suit, but the tight lines around his mouth betrayed his anxiety. We rehearsed the plan one last time. We would let my parents dictate the flow of the conversation. We would act intimidated by the luxurious setting and exhausted by the family drama. We would give them the illusion of absolute control. The drive to the restaurant took 45 minutes, but it felt like 45 seconds. The city streets blurred past my passenger window in a stream of red taillights and glowing street lamps. We did not play the radio. The silence inside the car was heavy with anticipation. I went over Agent Carter's instructions in my head, repeating them like a mantra. Let them brag. Let them threaten. Let them offer their fake olive branch. Every word they spoke would be captured and preserved forever in a federal evidence locker. I reached up and lightly brushed my fingers against the cool metal of the brooch, feeling the tiny, almost imperceptible vibration that confirmed the device was actively recording. David reached across the center console and grabbed my free hand, squeezing my fingers tightly. I squeezed back, anchoring myself to his solid, unwavering support. We pulled up to the valet stand at Le Petit Chateau exactly 5 minutes before our reservation time. The restaurant was a bastion of old-money prestige featuring heavy oak doors, manicured hedges, and an imposing stone facade. A valet in a crisp uniform opened my car door, and the crisp evening air hit my face, clearing away the last lingering remnants of my anxiety. I stood on the cobblestone walkway, adjusting my suit jacket and smoothing my expression into a mask of weary apprehension. David handed his keys to the valet, walked around the front of the car, and offered me his arm. I looped my arm through his, feeling the steady, rhythmic beating of my own pulse. I took one final deep breath, mentally locking away my identity as a forensic auditor and stepping fully into the role of the vulnerable daughter they expected to see. We walked up the wide stone steps together and pulled open the heavy ornate oak doors, stepping directly into the warm golden light and the soft, sophisticated murmur of the crowded, incredibly exclusive restaurant lobby. I kept my chin lowered slightly deliberately, letting David lead the way toward the restaurant's highly polished podium. The trap was officially set, armed and actively waiting. Now I just needed my arrogant parents to walk right into it and speak. The maitre d' led us through the dimly lit dining room. I spotted them in a semi-private alcove near the back. Richard and Patricia sat side by side on a plush velvet banquette. Brandon sat across from them, swirling amber liquid in a glass, looking entirely too pleased with himself. When Patricia saw us approaching, she stood up with a radiant smile, ignoring that I had her escorted out of my office building by armed guards days ago. She reached out to hug me. I forced my body to remain perfectly still, allowing her to wrap her arms around my shoulders in a suffocating embrace. Richard offered David a firm handshake, which David accepted with a polite nod. We took our seats opposite my parents. The waiter handed us heavy menus. The trap was set. The charade began instantly. Patricia sighed softly, looking at me with an expression of manufactured maternal grace. She told me how beautiful I looked and how glad she was that we could put all that unpleasantness behind us. Richard nodded, leaning forward with a conciliatory posture. He told David that family disputes were natural, but blood was always thicker than water. I kept my hands folded in my lap, deliberately making myself look small and uncertain. I murmured a quiet thank you, letting my eyes dart nervously around the table. Brandon laughed, leaning back in his chair and resting his ankle on his knee. He told me I needed to loosen up. He proudly announced his new venture was officially off the ground and that he was hosting a massive launch gala at the country club this coming weekend. He bragged about the caterers, the ice sculptures, and the elite guest list, boasting that he was about to revolutionize the tech industry. I listened to his arrogant rambling, fighting the urge to smile. He was funding ice sculptures with money stolen from sick children, bragging about it directly into a microphone hidden on my lapel. I looked down at my plate, letting my shoulders slump to complete the visual performance. I told them I was overwhelmed by everything that had happened over the past week. I admitted the local police had scared me, and I did not fully understand the complicated paperwork they had dropped on my front porch. I looked up at my father, forcing my eyes to convey desperate, helpless confusion. I told him I wanted to make things right and preserve our family, but I was terrified of going to jail for a commercial loan I never signed. I begged him to explain the logistics to me so I could feel safe. Richard took the bait immediately. He smiled a patronizing smile, clearly thrilled to be back in his element as the financial savior of the family. He told me I had nothing to worry about. He leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that the microphone picked up perfectly. He explicitly stated that he and my mother had handled all the complex legal structuring themselves. He bragged about how easily Patricia had answered my security questions to lift the credit freeze. He laughed as he admitted that they had practiced my signature for 3 days before stamping the power of attorney document. He assured me it was a flawless forgery and that the bank never suspected a thing. He told me they did it to protect me from the stress of the underwriting process. He patted my hand, promising that once I signed the retroactive consent form, the forgery would legally become a delegated authorization and I would be safe from prosecution. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my face remained a mask of anxious relief. I thanked him profusely for clarifying the legal shield, but I kept pushing for the rest of the puzzle. I looked at my mother and asked how they were possibly going to pay back a $1.2 million default. I told her I was terrified the bank would seize my house and destroy my marriage if the debt remained active. I needed her to explicitly mention the origin of the funds they were using. Patricia offered a dismissive wave of her manicured hand. She leaned in close, the scent of her expensive perfume overwhelming my senses. She told me the commercial loan was just a temporary bridge. She proudly confessed that Brandon had experienced a minor setback with his cryptocurrency investments, and she had simply borrowed idle funds from the Oakfield Children's Benevolent Fund to cover his margin calls. She bragged about her unrestricted access to the charity ledgers. She explained with chilling calmness that she had routed the donor money through the Delaware shell company they set up in my name, funneling the cash directly to Brandon so he would not lose his luxury lifestyle. She promised me that the commercial loan was going to be used to quietly refund the charity accounts before the annual independent audit next month. She smiled, entirely pleased with her own sociopathic ingenuity. She told me it was a brilliant, victimless strategy that kept Brandon afloat and protected the family name. Brandon raised his glass, toasting his mother's financial brilliance, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation a flawless, unassailable verbal confession to multiple federal crimes. David shifted slightly in his chair, his leg pressing reassuringly against mine under the table. I let out a long, shuddering breath, playing the role of the relieved, pacified daughter to absolute perfection. I told them I finally understood the full plan. I promised them I would review the consent forms tonight and sign them first thing in the morning so we could put this entire nightmare behind us. Patricia beamed with triumphant satisfaction, signaling the waiter to bring us a bottle of champagne to celebrate our family reconciliation. I sat quietly as the cork popped, knowing I had just secured the final nail in their coffin. We left the restaurant that night with the taste of expensive champagne lingering on my tongue like ash. David drove us home in silence, understanding the fragile state of my nerves. The moment we walked through our front door, I unclasped the designer brooch from my lapel and placed it carefully on the kitchen counter. I stared at the tiny piece of metal and plastic, realizing it held the key to my entire future and the complete destruction of my parents. The next morning, I did not sign the retroactive consent forms. Instead, I sent my mother a brief text message stating that my lawyer needed a few days to review the documents before I could legally execute them. I blamed corporate compliance rules to make the delay sound routine. Patricia replied with a passive-aggressive comment about my paranoia, but she accepted the excuse. She believed she had me contained. She thought I was just being my usual cautious self. She had absolutely no idea that I had already handed the audio recording directly to Special Agent Carter. A week passed. It was the most agonizing, surreal 7 days of my entire life. While the federal authorities worked silently in the background, securing subpoenas and locking down financial perimeters, my family engaged in a grotesque display of public celebration. I sat in my home office every evening, watching their victory lap unfold in real time across social media. They were completely unburdened by guilt or fear. They genuinely believed they had gotten away with stealing from sick children and framing their own daughter. The sheer arrogance of their digital footprint was nauseating. Brandon was the most egregious offender. By Thursday afternoon, his social media feeds had transformed into a relentless barrage of unearned wealth. He posted a video of himself walking into a high-end exotic car dealership. The next slide showed him revving the engine of a brand new slate gray Porsche. His caption read, "Hard work always pays off." I stared at the screen. My jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. He was literally driving a stolen vehicle funded by the Oakfield Children's Benevolent Fund. The absolute delusion required to post motivational quotes while financing a sports car with embezzled charity money was staggering. On Friday, he uploaded a professionally edited reel showcasing his new commercial office space. It was a sprawling modern loft in the trendy warehouse district featuring custom neon signs bearing his fake company logo and expensive ergonomic chairs. He filmed himself holding a glass of scotch and toasting to the camera. He talked about vision disruption and changing the tech landscape. He was playing the role of a Silicon Valley titan, entirely financed by a Delaware shell company registered under my stolen identity. Patricia was equally brazen, though her platform of choice was the local country club social circle and her curated Facebook page. She spent the week posting perfectly filtered photos of her pristine suburban life. There was a picture of her sitting on the patio of the country club, sipping a mimosa with the other charity board members. Her caption gushed about the importance of giving back to the community and how excited she was for the upcoming annual gala. I read her words and felt a wave of profound disgust wash over me. She was sitting next to women who trusted her, smiling for the camera, knowing full well she had drained their charitable accounts to zero. She posted a long, fawning tribute to Brandon on Saturday morning. It featured a picture of the two of them standing in front of his new Porsche. She wrote about how incredibly blessed she felt to be the mother of such a genius entrepreneur. She praised his resilience and his brilliant mind. There was no mention of me, of course. In her mind, I had simply served my purpose as the invisible bankroll. David watched this digital spectacle alongside me, his disgust mirroring my own. We sat on the couch on Sunday evening staring at my laptop screen as Brandon live-streamed a preview of his upcoming launch gala. He was walking through the country club ballroom, showing off the floral arrangements. The sheer scale of the waist was staggering. David wrapped his arm around my shoulders. "It is actually hard to comprehend," David said softly. "They are celebrating on the deck of the Titanic, and they have no idea the ship is already sinking." I leaned my head against his chest. "They think they won," I replied, my voice stripped of any remaining sympathy. "They think they outsmarted the bank, the charity, the police, and me. They are throwing a massive party to celebrate their own immunity." The contrast between their arrogant public lives and my quiet, relentless preparation was jarring. During the day, I maintained my professional facade at the accounting firm, auditing ledgers, as if my world was completely normal. At night, I sat in the darkness of my living room coordinating with federal agents. I provided them with timestamps of Brandon's purchases, matching his social media boasts, with the fraudulent credit card statements I had initially discovered. I mapped out the exact guest list for his upcoming launch gala, knowing that the charity board members Patricia had defrauded would be in attendance. I was helping the FBI construct the perfect stage for their absolute downfall. Every time my mother texted me an impatient reminder to sign the consent forms, I replied with a polite excuse. I told her my attorney was out of town. I fed her exactly enough reassurance to keep her pacified, expertly mirroring the same manipulative tactics she had used on me my entire life. I kept her comfortable. I ensured that she walked into that massive launch gala feeling absolutely invincible. The federal trap was fully armed, the evidence was incontrovertible, and the countdown had officially begun. I watched Brandon's live stream end with a smug smirk, and I allowed myself a cold, fleeting smile. The very next morning, my cell phone rang precisely at 8 o'clock. I was standing in my kitchen, pouring a cup of coffee before work. The caller ID displayed an unknown number, but I recognized the Washington area code immediately. I answered on the first ring. "Evelyn, we have everything we need," Special Agent Carter said. His voice lacked the usual bureaucratic caution. It was replaced by a sharp and focused intensity. The audio recording was absolutely flawless. Your parents detailed the mechanics of the forgery and the unauthorized transfer of charitable funds. Combined with the financial ledgers you provided last week, we were able to present an undeniable narrative to the United States Attorney's Office. I leaned against the granite countertop and let out a long breath. The tension that had been nesting in my shoulders since the dinner at Le Petit Chateau began to loosen. "Are they moving forward with the indictments?" I asked. Carter did not hesitate. "We are moving forward with a coordinated federal strike. The United States Attorney reviewed your forensic audit last night. He was thoroughly impressed by the meticulous nature of your documentation. Because your evidence is robust and the confession is on tape, we are bypassing the prolonged investigation phase. The prosecutor is fast-tracking the grand jury subpoenas today." I took a sip of my coffee and let the magnitude of his words settle over me. The federal government is a notoriously slow machine. It grinds along at an agonizing pace, bogged down by endless red tape and procedural hurdles. But I had eliminated all their blind spots. I had weaponized my decade of professional accounting experience to serve my family up on a silver platter. "I need you at the field office this afternoon," Carter continued. "The assistant federal prosecutor is drafting the asset freeze requests and search warrants. We need your eyes on the specific routing numbers one last time to lock down every account associated with that shell company." I told him I would be there at 2 o'clock and hung up the phone. David walked into the kitchen tying his tie for work. He took one look at my face and stopped. "Did they get the warrants?" he asked quietly. "They are drafting them today," I replied. "The prosecutor is expediting the entire process." That afternoon, I sat in a brightly lit conference room at the federal building. Agent Carter sat across from me alongside a sharp-eyed assistant federal prosecutor named Sarah Jenkins. The table was covered in thick stacks of paper. They were the search and seizure warrants being prepared for a federal judge. Jenkins handed me a printed list of bank routing numbers and offshore exchange addresses. "Ms. Hayes, I need you to verify these accounts," Jenkins said, her tone purely professional. "We are preparing to freeze the assets of the Oakfield Children's Benevolent Fund to prevent your mother from attempting to replace the stolen money with the commercial loan disbursement. We are freezing your brother's accounts and the holding company registered under your name. We will be seizing the vehicles purchased with the embezzled funds." I pulled a pen from my bag and checked each sequence of numbers against the ledger I had memorized. I confirmed the holding account in Delaware. I verified the regional bank in Wyoming. I pointed out one offshore cryptocurrency wallet that Brandon had bragged about on social media just yesterday. Jenkins made a quick notation and slid the document back into her folder. "Your mother sent another text message this morning asking about the retroactive consent forms," I told them. "She is getting impatient. She wants me to stop by her house tomorrow to sign them." "Keep stalling," her agent Carter instructed. "Tell her your lawyer found a minor discrepancy in the liability clause and needs until Friday to clear it up. We need to keep them entirely focused on you. If they think you are simply being difficult, they will not look over their shoulders. We have local law enforcement coordinating with us on the ground. Officer Miller and his partner are looped into the task force. They will be providing local jurisdiction support when we execute the arrest warrants." The sheer scale of the operation was breathtaking. I had started this process by dialing my local police precinct from my dining room table. Now a joint task force of federal agents and local detectives was actively planning a synchronized takedown. On Thursday evening, I sat in my living room with David. The television was playing softly in the background, but neither of us was watching it. My phone sat on the coffee table. At exactly 6 o'clock, the screen lit up with a call from Agent Carter. I answered and put him on speakerphone. The federal judge just signed the warrants, Carter announced. His voice was heavy with finality. The asset freezes go into effect at midnight tonight. The banks will lock down the accounts automatically. Your parents and your brother will wake up tomorrow morning completely locked out of the financial system. They will not be able to withdraw cash transfer funds or use those fraudulent credit cards. David reached over and grabbed my hand. When do you make the arrests? I asked. We execute the warrants on Saturday night, Carter replied. We know your brother is hosting a highly publicized launch gala at the country club. The charity board members will be present. It is the perfect controlled environment to secure all three suspects simultaneously, without allowing them the opportunity to destroy evidence at their respective homes. The trap is officially locked, Evelyn. You did it. I ended the call and placed my phone gently on the glass coffee table. David shifted closer to me, wrapping his arms securely around my shoulders in a comforting gesture of silent, unyielding solidarity. The massive federal storm had finally gathered its full strength, and the devastating lightning was absolutely about to strike them down. I sat perfectly still on the couch, listening to the steady rhythm of David breathing beside me. The television continued to murmur in the background, casting a flickering pale light across the living room walls. But the comfortable normalcy of our home felt incredibly distant. For weeks, I had operated on pure adrenaline and forensic calculation. I had compartmentalized every ounce of betrayal, locking away the terrified daughter to let the federal auditor take the wheel. But now, with the warrants signed and the asset freezes locking into place at midnight, the logistical battle was over. A tremor started in my hands. It was small at first, just a slight shake in my fingertips, but it quickly spread up my arms until my entire body was shivering. The reality of what was going to happen on Saturday night crashed over me with the crushing weight of a collapsing building. I was going to send my mother, my father, and my brother to federal prison. The people who had watched me take my first steps, who had packed my childhood lunches, who had clapped at my college graduation, were going to be stripped of their freedom, their dignity, and their future because of a dossier I had personally compiled and handed to the federal government. David shifted on the couch and turned toward me. He noticed the violent shaking immediately. He reached over and picked up a heavy, woven throw blanket from the armrest, draping it carefully over my shoulders. He did not ask if I was okay, knowing perfectly well that I was not. Instead, he pulled me closer, tucking my head securely under his chin. His hand stroked my hair in a slow, repetitive motion that grounded me to the present moment. I closed my eyes and let out a broken, ragged breath that sounded entirely too much like a sob. "I feel like a monster," I whispered into the quiet room. The words tasted like ash on my tongue, but they needed to be spoken aloud. I know it is justice. I know they committed federal crimes and stole from sick children. But a small part of me keeps hearing my mother telling me that family requires sacrifice. A small part of me feels like I am betraying the most fundamental rule of being a daughter. David stopped stroking my hair. He placed his hands on my shoulders and gently pushed me back just enough so he could look directly into my eyes. His expression was fiercely protective, entirely devoid of pity, but overflowing with profound, unwavering love. "You are not a monster, Evelyn." David said, his voice carrying the solid, immovable weight of absolute truth. "You are the only person in this entire situation who has shown any actual integrity. You need to listen to me right now, and you need to believe what I am saying. They stopped being your parents the exact second they forged your signature on that commercial loan. They stopped being your family the moment they decided to frame you for a federal felony to protect Brandon." I swallowed hard, fighting the tears that threatened to spill over my eyelashes. "They raised me," I murmured. playing the ultimate devil advocate against my own survival. And they used that raising to weaponize your identity. David countered instantly, refusing to let me sink into their manufactured guilt. Raising a child does not give you the right to destroy them. It does not grant you a lifetime pass to commit financial ruin and expect a thank you note in return. Think about what would have happened if you had not caught this. Evelyn. Think about the federal agents kicking down this door instead of theirs. Think about you sitting in a holding cell facing decades behind bars, while your mother sat at her country club sipping champagne and playing the tragic victim. They were perfectly willing to let you lose your career, your freedom, and your future. They were going to throw you to the wolves without losing a single night of sleep. His words hit me like a splash of freezing water. The terrifying reality of their plan completely extinguished the lingering, misplaced guilt. David was absolutely right. They had constructed a trap designed to obliterate my life. They had banked on my loyalty to shield their profound greed. Family is not defined by shared DNA. David continued, his voice softening as he reached up to wipe a stray tear from my cheek. Family is about who protects you. Family is about who stands by you when the world falls apart. Family does not set you up to take the fall for their crimes. I am your family, Evelyn. We built this life together and we protect each other. You are not betraying them. You are simply holding them accountable for betraying you. I looked at my husband, absorbing the absolute certainty in his eyes. He had been my anchor through the entire storm. When I found the box on the porch, he did not doubt me. When the extended relatives attacked me, he stood by me. He had helped me navigate the deepest, darkest betrayal of my life, without ever once asking me to compromise my own safety for the sake of biological obligation. He was my chosen family, the partner I had deliberately selected to share my life. The shivering finally stopped. The cold, creeping doubt was entirely replaced by a warm, solid resolve. I pulled the woven blanket tighter around my shoulders and leaned forward, pressing my forehead against his chest. I listened to the steady, reassuring thud of his heartbeat. I am making absolutely sure that the consequences land exactly where they belong. David kissed my forehead, wrapping his arms around me. We have one more day until the launch gala, he said quietly. One more day of playing their game, and then we watch the house of cards collapse. I closed my eyes and let out a long breath. The federal machinery was in motion, completely unstoppable. I felt a profound peace. I was fully ready for Saturday night to finally arrive and completely shatter their stolen luxury world forever. Saturday evening arrived with crisp autumn air and perfectly clear skies over the wealthy suburbs. David and I pulled our modest sedan up to the towering wrought iron gates of the Oakfield Hills Country Club. The driveway was already lined with imported luxury vehicles, stretching all the way up to the massive columned entrance. At the very front of the valet line, parked specifically to ensure every arriving guest was forced to admire it, sat Brandon's brand new slate gray Porsche. It was a monument to his manufactured success and a glaring physical piece of federal evidence. I handed my keys to the valet and stepped onto the immaculate brick pathway. I wore a tailored black evening gown, simple and understated, offering a stark contrast to the loud, opulent display waiting for us inside the clubhouse. David stood beside me in a sharp, dark suit. He offered his arm and I took it, feeling the steady and reassuring rhythm of his breathing. We walked up the wide stone steps and handed our coats to the attendant in the grand foyer. The heavy mahogany doors to the main ballroom stood wide open, spilling golden light, and the sound of a live string quartet out into the hallway. We stepped into the ballroom, and the sheer scale of the financial waste hit me like a physical blow. Brandon had spared absolutely no expense in spending the money he had stolen from sick children. Massive floral centerpieces overflowing with white orchids and imported roses anchored dozens of tables, draped in silver silk linens. Two enormous ice sculptures carved into the shape of his fake company logo flanked a fully stocked premium open bar. Waitstaff circulated through the elegantly dressed crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with expensive champagne and caviar appetizers. The room was packed with the town elite. I recognized local politicians, wealthy real estate developers, and several prominent members of the country club board of directors. Sitting at a prime VIP table near the front stage was the entire executive committee of the Oakfield Children's Benevolent Fund. They were sipping their stolen champagne and smiling warmly at my parents, completely unaware that their charitable foundation had been systematically drained to pay for the very party they were currently attending. Brandon stood near the center of the room, holding a crystal tumbler of scotch. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that cost more than my first car. He was surrounded by a circle of wealthy investors loudly bragging about his visionary approach to the digital tech market and his plans for global expansion. He looked incredibly smug, soaking up the unearned admiration like a sponge. Across the room, I spotted my father Richard holding court with a group of older gentlemen. He was laughing deeply, patting a local judge on the back and projecting the image of the proud, wealthy patriarch. And then I saw my mother. Patricia was standing near the charity board members, wearing a glittering emerald green designer gown that commanded attention. She was holding a champagne flute and gesturing gracefully as she told some undoubtedly fabricated story about her philanthropic dedication. She looked completely in her element, absolutely thriving in the center of the high society validation she craved more than anything else in the world. David and I remained near the entrance, standing quietly in the shadows of a massive floral arrangement. We did not grab drinks. We did not attempt to mingle. We simply stood and watched the grotesque performance unfold. It took exactly 12 minutes for Patricia to notice we were there. I saw her eyes sweep across the room and lock onto my face. The warm, gracious smile instantly vanished from her features, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated venom. She whispered something urgently to Richard, who turned and glared in our direction. Patricia handed her champagne flute to a passing waiter and began marching across the ballroom floor. She navigated through the crowd of wealthy guests with aggressive speed, her emerald gown swishing furiously around her ankles. She did not want to make a scene in front of her high society friends, so she kept her voice lowered to a harsh, threatening whisper as she closed the final few feet between us. "What on earth are you doing here?" Patricia hissed, stopping just inches from my face. "I explicitly told you this was a closed corporate event. You were not invited, Evelyn. You are completely ruining the aesthetic of this launch. Brandon is entertaining vital investors, and the absolute last thing he needs is his bitter, jealous sister standing in the corner glaring at everyone." I looked at my mother, absorbing the sheer audacity of her entitlement. She had forged my signature to $1 million commercial loan, stolen my identity, and embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from the charity board members sitting just 50 feet away. Yet her primary concern in this moment was that my simple black dress was disrupting the visual perfection of her stolen luxury party. She actually believed she still held the authority to dismiss me. "I'm not leaving," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and level. Patricia stepped closer, her eyes flashing with desperate anger. "You are going to turn around and walk out those doors right now, Evelyn," she demanded, her tone dripping with quiet menace. "I will not allow you to ruin the most important night of your brother's life just because you are incapable of supporting his success. If you do not leave immediately, I am going to have the country club management physically remove you for trespassing. We are done playing these games." I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or attempt to defend my presence in the ballroom. I simply looked past her shoulder toward the heavy mahogany doors of the main entrance. The timing was absolutely flawless. I took a deliberate step backward, pulling David with me, and smoothly stepped aside to clear the main aisle of the ballroom. "I am not the one who is going to ruin his night," I said softly. My mother frowned, her meticulously drawn eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. She opened her mouth to issue another threat, but the words died in her throat. The heavy mahogany doors behind me swung open with a resounding crash that echoed over the live string quartet. The music faltered and ground to an awkward, jarring halt. A sudden heavy silence fell over the massive ballroom as the guests turned to look at the entrance. Special Agent Thomas Carter stepped into the golden light of the country club ballroom. He was flanked by 6 federal agents in dark tactical jackets bearing the FBI insignia on the back. Right behind them marched Officer Miller and a dozen uniformed local police officers. The sheer volume of law enforcement personnel pouring into the opulent space was staggering. They fanned out with practiced military precision, instantly securing every single exit and blocking the doors to the catering kitchens. The wealthy guests gasped, stepping back and clutching their champagne glasses in utter shock. The festive atmosphere evaporated instantly, replaced by a thick, suffocating blanket of absolute panic. Agent Carter walked directly into the center of the ballroom. His authoritative presence commanded the entire room. He did not shout, but his deep, booming voice carried easily across the sudden silence. "Nobody move," Carter instructed firmly. "This is a coordinated federal operation. We are executing multiple felony arrest warrants and securing this premises for immediate asset seizure." Brandon dropped his crystal tumbler of scotch. It shattered against the polished hardwood floor, sending amber liquid and ice scattering across the toes of his expensive custom tuxedo shoes. He stared at the federal agents with wide, terrified eyes, completely paralyzed by shock. 2 FBI agents moved swiftly across the room, cutting through the crowd of stunned investors. They grabbed Brandon by the arms, spun him around, and slammed his wrists together behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the quiet room was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Richard attempted to run. He shoved past the local judge he had been laughing with just moments before and made a desperate, pathetic dash toward the side patio doors. Officer Miller and another local detective intercepted him before he could take 5 steps. They tackled my father against a linen-draped cocktail table, sending silver trays of caviar crashing to the floor. Richard shouted in protest, demanding they unhand him, and threatening to sue the entire police department. But his blustering country club threats meant absolutely nothing to federal authorities. They hauled him to his feet, wrenched his arms behind his back, and secured the steel cuffs around his wrists tightly. Patricia stood frozen in front of me, perfectly still. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a stark, sickly gray beneath her expensive makeup. She looked from her golden child, crying in handcuffs, to her husband being shoved against a cocktail table, and finally, to the federal agents marching purposefully in her direction. An FBI agent stepped up to my mother and recited her Miranda rights in a loud, clear voice, listing the charges of felony wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and corporate embezzlement. He grabbed her wrists and forced them behind her back, locking the heavy metal cuffs into place. Patricia snapped out of her paralyzed state and began to fight. She twisted violently in the agent's grip, her emerald gown tearing slightly at the seam. "This is a mistake," Patricia screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the crystal chandeliers. "This is a massive misunderstanding. We are upstanding citizens. I am the chairperson of the Oakfield Children's Benevolent Fund. You cannot do this to us. Let me go immediately. We have done absolutely nothing wrong." I stepped forward, leaving David standing in the shadows, and walked calmly into the center of the room. The entire country club elite watched me in stunned silence as I bypassed my screaming mother and walked directly toward the VIP table near the stage. Sitting at the table was Beatrice, the president of the charity board of directors. Beatrice was trembling, her hands covering her mouth in sheer horror as she watched her trusted colleague being arrested by federal authorities. I stopped in front of Beatrice and opened my small black evening clutch. I pulled out a thick-bound manila folder containing the exact same forensic dossier I had given to the FBI. It held every bank statement, every wire transfer receipt, and the complete digital paper trail showing Patricia draining the charity accounts to pay for the ice sculptures currently melting behind the bar. "Beatrice," I said, keeping my voice gentle but perfectly clear, "I am Evelyn Hayes. I am a forensic auditor. I strongly advise you to contact the legal counsel for your foundation immediately. Inside this folder is the definitive proof that Patricia Hayes embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from your charity to fund her son's cryptocurrency losses and to pay for this gala tonight. Every single dime is gone." Beatrice took the folder with shaking hands, her eyes welling with devastated tears. The other board members crowded around her, staring at the financial documents in absolute horror. The realization that they had been betrayed by their own chairperson rippled through the room, turning the confusion of the wealthy guests into a profound collective outrage. I turned around and walked back toward the entrance where Patricia was still struggling against the federal agents. She saw me hand the dossier to Beatrice, and the last remaining shred of her sanity completely fractured. "You did this?" Patricia shrieked at me, tears of pure rage streaming down her face. "You vindictive, horrible monster! You set us up! We are your family, and you destroyed us over a simple misunderstanding." I stopped just a few feet away from my mother. I looked at Brandon crying pathetically as he was dragged toward the door. I looked at Richard bowing his head in total humiliation as the local judge watched him being hauled away. And then I looked directly into my mother's wild, desperate eyes. "You told me not to make a scene," I said, my voice dropping into a cold, deadly register that carried perfectly through the silent ballroom. "But you forgot. I am an auditor. I do not make scenes. I make paper trails." I turned my back on them completely. David stepped forward, offered his arm, and we walked out the heavy mahogany doors into the cool night air, leaving my family to the federal authorities. 6 months later, the harsh, bitter winter had finally melted away, giving way to a bright and incredibly warm spring season. The massive federal legal fallout from the country club raid had dominated the local news cycle for weeks, thoroughly dismantling the pristine, wealthy facade my parents had spent their entire lives desperately trying to construct. Because the forensic evidence I had provided to Special Agent Carter was absolutely insurmountable, and because my mother and father had explicitly confessed to the forgery and embezzlement on the audio recording I captured at the restaurant, their defense attorneys possessed practically zero leverage in the courtroom. Faced with the terrifying reality of a prolonged, highly publicized federal trial and the overwhelming probability of serving maximum consecutive sentences, Richard and Brandon both chose to accept restrictive plea deals from the United States Attorney's Office. My father, the man who had always demanded absolute respect and country club compliance, was sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary for his role in orchestrating the multi-state wire fraud and the elaborate money laundering scheme. Brandon, the perpetually failing golden child, who believed he was destined to be a billionaire tech visionary, received a 5-year federal prison sentence for receiving stolen funds and participating in the massive commercial loan fraud. The luxury sports cars, the expensive loft office space, and every single frozen asset they possessed were formally seized by the government to begin paying back the commercial lender. My mother, Patricia, faced the most devastating consequences of all. The federal judge refused to grant her any leniency, citing her egregious abuse of trust as the chairperson of the Oakfield Children's Benevolent Fund. Stealing donation money from sick and disadvantaged youth to fund her son's reckless cryptocurrency gambling earned her a 10-year sentence in a federal correctional facility. But for a woman whose entire existence revolved around social hierarchy and neighborhood prestige, the prison sentence was only a fraction of her punishment. Her social standing was utterly, completely obliterated. The wealthy country club friends she had spent decades courting abandoned her, instantly treating her name like a toxic virus. The community charity board filed a massive civil lawsuit against her, plunging her into a bottomless ocean of insurmountable legal debt that would essentially guarantee she would remain entirely bankrupt for the rest of her natural life. The empire of lies she had built to protect her fragile ego had collapsed into absolute dust. I did not attend their sentencing hearings. I did not read the tearful letters Brandon tried to send me through his public defender begging for character references. I had permanently severed the toxic chain that tied me to their chaos, and I refused to let their desperate legal maneuvering drag me back into the darkness. I had spent 33 years absorbing the heavy, punishing weight of their conditional love, and I was entirely finished paying the toll for their destructive vanity. On a quiet, sunny Saturday morning, David and I sat together on the wide wooden porch of our home. The neighborhood was peaceful, filled with the gentle sounds of birds singing and the distant hum of a lawnmower. I was curled up in a comfortable wicker chair, wearing a soft, oversized sweater, holding a steaming mug of black coffee. David sat right beside me, reading a design architecture book, his presence offering the same steady, unwavering comfort he had provided since the very beginning of the nightmare. Our life had returned to a beautiful, boring state of absolute normalcy. I had received a significant promotion at the accounting firm, recognized by the senior partners for my unyielding ethical boundaries and my forensic precision. We were planning a long overdue vacation to Italy, and we were finally discussing expanding our chosen family on our own terms. The local mail carrier walked up the driveway and dropped a small stack of envelopes into the black metal mailbox attached to our porch railing. David set his book down, walked over to collect the mail, and began sorting through the various bills and catalogs. He stopped suddenly, staring down at a standard white envelope. The return address printed in the corner bore the official seal of a federal correctional facility located 3 states away. David walked back over and gently handed the envelope to me. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It was the same elegant looping cursive that had been written on the pale yellow sticky note left on my porch 6 months ago. It was a letter from Patricia. I sat my coffee mug down on the small wooden table beside my chair and took the envelope. I held it in my hands, feeling the thin, cheap institutional paper. I knew exactly what was written inside without having to read a single word. It would be a desperate pleading letter begging for financial help with her overwhelming legal fees. It would be filled with manipulative apologies, manufactured guilt trips, and frantic reminders that she was my mother and that family required sacrifice. She would be hoping that the passage of time had softened my resolve, and that the obedient, forgiving daughter would finally return to rescue her from the miserable consequences of her own actions. I looked at the envelope for a long, quiet moment. I did not feel a sudden rush of anger. I did not feel a suffocating wave of guilt or a desperate longing for maternal closure. The emotional hold she previously possessed over my mind had been completely, entirely, permanently severed. I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, unshakable peace. David watched me closely, waiting to see if I wanted to open it. I did not say a word. I simply stood up from my wicker chair, walked over to the heavy-duty paper shredder we kept tucked inside the entryway of the house, and pressed the activation button. The machine hummed to life. I dropped the unopened envelope directly into the metal teeth. I stood and watched as the blades pulled the paper downward, shredding my mother's final desperate manipulation into dozens of tiny, meaningless ribbons of confetti. I turned the machine off, walked back out onto the sunlit porch, and sat down next to my husband. I picked up my warm mug of coffee, took a slow, deep sip, and leaned my head happily against his shoulder, choosing my own beautiful peace over their endless chaos forever. If there is one profound truth surviving this ordeal has taught me, it is this: blood does not equate to unconditional loyalty. From the time we are children, society conditions us to believe that family is an unbreakable bond, an institution that demands endless forgiveness and constant sacrifice. But loyalty should never require your own destruction. My parents weaponized the very concept of family to shield their greed, vanity, and criminal behavior. They demanded my silence and compliance while offering nothing but profound betrayal in return. The hardest yet most vital lesson I learned is that setting ironclad boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You do not owe your future, your mental peace, or your legal freedom to people who only view you as a convenient tool for their own survival. We are often pressured to forgive and forget, but true forgiveness does not mean handing your abusers the keys to your life so they can destroy it all over again. True family, your chosen family, protects you. They stand by your side in the darkest moments. They do not forge your signature, they do not gaslight your reality, and they certainly do not ask you to take the fall for their catastrophic mistakes. Walking away from a toxic bloodline does not make you a monster, it makes you a survivor. I chose to conduct a forensic audit of my own life, cut the liabilities, and invest my energy exclusively into the people who genuinely valued me. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with family members who took advantage of your loyalty? How did you finally find the strength to walk away? Share your story in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about setting unbreakable boundaries and reclaiming your personal power. Remember, you are the only one who holds the pen to your life story. Don't ever let anyone else forge your signature.